Guilt tripping is the emotional equivalent of someone handing you a heavy backpack and insisting you carry it for them, except the contents aren't yours. It's a subtle, manipulative tactic often used to control others by evoking guilt for things they may not be responsible for. It doesn't start with open confrontation. It begins with a sigh, a disappointed look, or a quiet, "I guess it doesn't matter to you." It's an invisible string that tugs at your conscience, making you second-guess your decisions and emotional boundaries. At first glance, guilt tripping can look like simple emotional honesty. But dig a little deeper, and you'll find it's more about control than vulnerability. Imagine this: you've had an exhausting week at work, and you finally carve out an evening to rest. A friend messages you to hang out. You explain that you're tired and need time to recharge. Instead of understanding, they reply with, "Wow, I guess I only matter when it's convenient for you." In that moment, your plan to relax is ambushed by self-doubt and shame. You feel like a bad friend for choosing rest. That's the trap. Guilt tripping reframes healthy self-care as neglect. It makes your no feel like betrayal. Suddenly, you're not just tired. You're a villain in someone else's story. What makes guilt tripping so effective is that it hijacks our empathy. Most people don't want to hurt others. We're hardwired to respond to the pain of those we care about. Manipulators know this and use it to bend situations to their liking. Instead of clearly stating their needs, they deploy passive-aggressive comments to elicit a sense of wrongdoing in the other person. They bypass honest communication, replacing it with insinuations and emotional hooks. Over time, you're not making decisions based on your values or needs. You're just trying to avoid that heavy, sinking feeling of being the bad one. Another layer of guilt tripping is its slippery nature. It's rarely direct, which makes it difficult to challenge without sounding defensive or cold. If someone says, "I'm just hurt that you didn't show up," it might be genuine. But if every interaction includes reminders of how you've let them down, failed them, or caused their unhappiness, that's manipulation disguised as sentiment. It's the weaponization of disappointment. And what's insidious is that the guilt tripper often avoids responsibility for their own emotions by making you responsible for fixing them. In family dynamics, guilt tripping can take even deeper roots. Parents might say things like, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me," implying that your independence is a form of betrayal. Children grow up internalizing that love is conditional and must be earned through sacrifice or self-denial. The result? Adults who struggle with setting boundaries constantly overextend themselves and feel anxious when they say no. That inner voice saying, "You're selfish," didn't come from nowhere. It was planted and watered by years of emotional coercion masquerading as love. Romantic relationships are also fertile ground for guilt tripping. One partner might use illness, sadness, or emotional withdrawal as a tool to guilt the other into compliance. "If you really love me, you do this for me," becomes the silent anthem of manipulation. It's not that one can't express needs or feelings. Those are essential in any relationship. But when expressions of hurt become transactions, where love, attention, or peace is withheld unless the other person yields, that's no longer emotional intimacy. It's psychological warfare dressed in affection's clothing. What's tricky is that guilt tripping often hides behind good intentions. It can sound like care, concern, or disappointment. That's why many people don't recognize it when it's happening. They think they're being emotionally generous by giving in. But generosity born out of guilt isn't generosity. It's emotional debt payment. Over time, the person being guilt-tripped may become resentful, exhausted, and disconnected from their own needs. They lose track of where they end and the other person begins. Their emotional compass stops pointing inward and is permanently magnetized to someone else's expectations. The cycle often continues because guilt tripping works. At least in the short term. It gets results. The manipulator feels hurt or gets their way. The person guilt feels relieved to have avoided conflict. But it's a fragile peace, built on suppression rather than understanding. The damage accumulates in silence. Trust erodes. Communication becomes filtered through anxiety. Eventually, the relationship becomes less about connection and more about emotional landmines. The guilt tripper is always the victim. And the other person is always walking on eggshells, afraid to step the wrong way. To break this cycle, the first step is awareness. Recognizing guilt tripping requires tuning into how interactions make you feel. If you leave a conversation feeling heavy, ashamed, or anxious without a clear reason, pause. Ask yourself, are you being asked to take responsibility for someone else's emotional state? Are you being made to feel bad for saying no, setting a boundary, or prioritizing your needs? If so, that's not your burden to carry. It's a backpack full of someone else's issues, and you have every right to set it down. Boundaries are the antidote to guilt tripping. Not walls. Boundaries. Clear communication that honors both your needs and the other person's humanity. Saying things like, I understand you're upset, but I'm not okay with being made to feel guilty for prioritizing my well-being, recenters the conversation on healthy ground. It doesn't guarantee the guilt tripper will stop. But it sends a message, I see what you're doing, and I won't play this game. You're allowed to care deeply without caving in. You can love someone and still say no. Ultimately, guilt tripping thrives in environments where self-worth is outsourced. When your sense of goodness depends on keeping others happy, guilt tripping will always find a way in. But when you recognize that your worth isn't based on how much you sacrifice, something shifts. You start living in emotional integrity instead of obligation. And the guilt tripper? They either evolve into someone who can have honest conversations, or they fade into the distance, looking for someone else to carry their emotional bags. Gaslighting is one of the most insidious forms of psychological manipulation, a quiet erosion of reality that often begins with simple confusion and ends in full-blown self-doubt. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't come with flashing signs. Instead, it slips in unnoticed, altering your perception of the world one small moment at a time. Imagine being told that something you vividly remember didn't happen. At first, you might laugh it off or question the other person's memory. But if it happens repeatedly, if your recollections are constantly disputed, minimized, or rewritten, you start to question yourself. Maybe you're the one who misremembered. Maybe you are being too sensitive. Maybe you are the problem. That's the hallmark of gaslighting. It makes you feel like your thoughts, feelings, and even your senses can't be trusted. It's psychological fog. The person doing the gaslighting, often a partner, family member, friend, or authority figure, gradually replaces your version of events with their own until their truth becomes your reality. You stop trusting your instincts and start leaning on them for guidance. It's a process that can happen slowly, subtly, and with terrifying effectiveness. You're not told outright that you're wrong. You're told you're overreacting. You're told it didn't happen that way. You're told you misunderstood. And little by little, you start believing it. Gaslighting works because it preys on one of our most human vulnerabilities, the desire to be understood, accepted, and loved. No one wants to think the people they care about would intentionally deceive them. So instead of assuming manipulation, we assume we're flawed. We second-guess our memories. We silence our instincts. We let ourselves be reprogrammed. And this is exactly what the gaslighter wants. They want you to question your perceptions so that they can insert their version of the truth. And because we all want to avoid conflict, we start adapting to their version of events just to keep the peace. The term gaslighting comes from the 1938 play Gaslight, in which a husband dims the lights in the house and then denies that anything has changed. When his wife points it out, he insists she's imagining things. Slowly, she begins to believe she's going mad. This form of manipulation is subtle but powerful, and it's particularly dangerous because it targets a person's foundation, their perception of reality. Unlike overt forms of abuse that leave visible scars, gaslighting leaves you questioning whether the wounds exist at all. In relationships, gaslighting can look like a partner dismissing your concerns with a simple, "You're just being dramatic." It can be an argument where your feelings are reframed as irrational. It can be consistent denial of things said or done, even when you clearly remember them. You might hear phrases like, "That never happened," "You're imagining things," or "You always make things up." Over time, this creates a mental imbalance. The more you hear these dismissals, the more unstable your internal compass becomes. You stop trusting yourself and start deferring to the person who's been rewriting your reality. One of the cruelest aspects of gaslighting is how it isolates the victim from their own mind. You may start to feel like you're losing grip on your memories, your instincts, even your emotions. You might begin writing things down, just to prove to yourself later that you were right. You might replay conversations in your head obsessively, trying to figure out if you really were as unreasonable as they said you were. The internal monologue turns toxic, filled with doubts that weren't there before. Slowly, your sense of self fractures. Gaslighting isn't always done with malicious intent. Some people gaslight unconsciously, out of their own need to avoid responsibility or maintain control. But whether it's calculated or reflexive, the impact is the same. The victim ends up questioning themselves while the gaslighter gets to stay in control. And once someone has you doubting your own mind, they have incredible power over your decisions, emotions, and actions. It becomes easy for them to steer you through shame, confusion, or guilt toward the behaviors and beliefs they prefer. What makes gaslighting so dangerous is that it's often accompanied by other forms of emotional manipulation. It doesn't occur in a vacuum. It's usually part of a pattern of behavior that includes guilt-tripping, stonewalling, love bombing, or even passive-aggressive punishment. The goal is not just to alter your perception, but to mold your identity into something more pliable, more convenient for them. A person being gaslit may become excessively apologetic, anxious, or hesitant to speak their mind. They may stay silent, not because they don't have something to say, but because they've been trained to believe that what they say is invalid. The long-term effects of gaslighting can be devastating. People who experience it often develop anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and a constant need for external validation. They become people pleasers, afraid to upset others or stand up for themselves. The mental fatigue of constantly questioning your own reality can lead to emotional burnout. You start to feel like a shadow of the person you used to be, unsure of where you end, and the manipulator begins. You lose touch with your inner voice, the one that used to guide you through life. But there is a way out. The first step in healing from gaslighting is recognition. You have to begin by trusting your experiences again, by giving yourself permission to believe what you felt, what you heard, and what you saw. This is not easy, especially if you've been told for a long time that your reality is unreliable. But healing begins when you validate your own perspective. Journaling can help. Speaking with trusted friends can help. Therapy, especially with someone trained in trauma and abuse, can help. Bit by bit, you begin reclaiming your truth. Setting boundaries is also crucial. When someone tries to twist your reality, it's okay to say, "I remember it differently." You don't have to argue or convince them. You don't even have to defend yourself. The point is not to win the debate. It's to preserve your sanity. And if you consistently feel invalidated, you have the right to walk away. Your peace of mind is not up for negotiation. No one has the right to occupy your headspace and rearrange the furniture against your will. In the end, gaslighting is not about memory. It's not even about truth. It's about control. It's about someone else trying to write your narrative while stealing the pen from your hand. Reclaiming that pen. Rewriting your own story, one clear sentence at a time, is how you break free. Your reality is not a debate. Your feelings are not fiction. You are allowed to trust yourself, to believe in your own mind, and to stand firmly in your own truth. Love bombing often feels like the beginning of a perfect story. The messages come fast and filled with admiration. The compliments are endless. The gestures are extravagant. You're being flooded with affection, attention, and declarations that you are unlike anyone else in the world. In the early stages, it feels like you've stumbled into a fairy tale. But beneath the roses, beneath the sweet words and sweeping gestures, there's a quiet manipulation unfolding. Love bombing isn't about love. It's about control disguised as devotion. At its core, love bombing is a manipulation tactic where someone overwhelms you with affection and attention in an effort to gain influence over your emotions and decisions. It doesn't start slow. It begins in overdrive. They might call you their soulmate within days, say they'd never felt this way about anyone before, or talk about a future together long before trust and mutual understanding have had a chance to grow. The intensity is seductive, and you find yourself swept away in the current of their affection. But it's not sustainable. And that's the trap. What makes love bombing so difficult to detect is that it masquerades as ideal romance. In a world where people crave connection and are starved for genuine affection, this sudden wave of attention can feel like finding an oasis in the desert. You're finally being seen, valued, adored. But love, in its healthy form, grows gradually. It builds on patience, mutual respect, and authenticity. Love bombing skips all of that. It skips the foundation and tries to build a skyscraper on sand. Because the goal isn't love. It's attachment. The person doing the love bombing wants you emotionally invested as quickly as possible. By flooding you with affection, they aim to fast-track emotional intimacy before you've had time to truly assess the relationship. They want you to depend on them. To crave their validation the way a person craves air after being underwater. And once that emotional dependency is formed, the real shift happens. The compliments slow down. The calls become inconsistent. The warmth turns cold. You're left chasing the high of those early days, wondering what you did wrong, and trying harder to get back to that intoxicating beginning. This is where the control sets in. The person who once showered you with love now holds it hostage. They give it in small doses, creating a reward system that keeps you emotionally hooked. It becomes a cycle of highs and lows. Affection followed by withdrawal, closeness followed by distance. You begin to feel anxious, constantly trying to prove yourself worthy of the love they once gave so freely. And because they gave you so much in the beginning, you feel guilty questioning the sudden shift. Maybe you're overthinking it. Maybe you've changed. Maybe it's your fault. But it's not your fault. Love bombing is a manipulation strategy used to destabilize a person's emotional baseline. It's common in toxic relationships, narcissistic abuse, and even cults. It's about power. By making someone feel emotionally indebted, the love bomber gains control. And once you're hooked, they can shape the narrative. They might become critical, controlling, or even abusive. And because you're already emotionally entangled, leaving becomes difficult. You're not just trying to escape a bad situation. You're trying to let go of a dream they sold you in the beginning. Love bombing doesn't only happen in romantic relationships. It can happen in friendships, families, and even workplaces. A friend might constantly praise you, want to spend all their time with you, and make you feel like you're the most important person in their life, only to later use that emotional closeness to manipulate you into doing what they want. A parent might alternate between over-the-top affection and cold detachment, using love as a bargaining chip. A boss might treat you like a star employee, offering perks and praise, then use that attachment to overwork you or demand loyalty without question. The danger of love bombing lies in how disorienting it is. The emotional contrast between the affection and the withdrawal creates confusion and self-doubt. You might start wondering if you're imagining things or being too sensitive. You may convince yourself that the relationship is still good because the beginning was so magical. But that's the nature of the trap. The beginning is the bait. The emotional whiplash that follows keeps you stuck, constantly trying to win back the affection that once flowed freely. Recognizing love bombing requires paying attention to the pace and intensity of emotional developments. Healthy love takes time. If someone is already talking about moving in together, marriage, or deep soul-level connection within days or weeks, that's not necessarily romantic. It can be a red flag. Pay attention to whether the relationship allows room for your individuality, your boundaries, your pace. If the affection feels more like a flood than a stream, it's okay to slow things down. Real love doesn't rush. Real love respects your need to move at a comfortable speed. Boundaries are your protection against love bombing. It's okay to say no. It's okay to take your time. It's okay to feel flattered by affection and still remain cautious. You don't have to match someone's intensity to prove your feelings. In fact, being cautious in the face of overwhelming attention is a sign of emotional intelligence. Trust isn't built through flattery. It's built through consistency, respect, and shared values over time. Anyone who tries to bypass that process might not be in it for the right reasons. If you realize you've been love bombed, it's important not to blame yourself. The tactics used are often subtle and incredibly persuasive. The point isn't to shame yourself. It's to become aware, to reclaim your emotional clarity, and to regain your footing. Surround yourself with people who reflect your worth without strings attached. Seek support from those who validate your feelings instead of manipulating them. Rebuilding your sense of self after love bombing can take time, but it's worth every step. You deserve love that doesn't confuse you. Love that feels steady, not addictive. In the end, love bombing is not about you being special. It's about someone trying to make you feel special so they can control you. The true danger lies not in the intensity of their affection, but in how that affection is used as a tool. Real love doesn't come with a hook. It doesn't make you feel anxious, dependent, or unsure. It holds space for you to be whole, independent, and fully yourself. You deserve that kind of love. And it starts by recognizing when something isn't love at all. Just manipulation wearing a mask. The silent treatment is one of the most subtle and agonizing forms of emotional manipulation. It doesn't shout. It doesn't argue. It simply withdraws. And in that absence, in the long, aching quiet, it speaks volumes. This tactic isn't about silence for peace. It's silence for control. It creates a void so loud that you start to question everything, what you did wrong, how you could fix it, and whether you're even worth speaking to. The person delivering the silent treatment might say nothing at all, but their message is unmistakable. You are being punished, and you are the one expected to fix it. It often begins after a disagreement or a moment of vulnerability. You express a concern. You voice a need. You say something that doesn't align with the other person's expectations. And instead of engaging, instead of having a conversation, they go silent. They don't return your texts. They ignore your calls. They walk past you in the hallway or sit across the room pretending you don't exist. It feels like being locked out of a space you thought you belonged in. You reach out for clarity, but all you receive is emptiness. And that emptiness becomes a mirror reflecting your shame, your confusion, and your growing desperation for resolution. What makes the silent treatment so devastating is that it targets our basic human need for connection. We are social beings. We crave acknowledgement, even in conflict. Being ignored, especially by someone we care about, triggers deep emotional alarm bells. It feels like rejection on a cellular level. You begin to question your worth, your role in the relationship, and your ability to maintain it. And the longer the silence stretches, the more it warps your perspective. Suddenly, the original issue fades into the background, and the silence becomes the central problem you feel desperate to solve. But here's the trap: the person giving the silent treatment isn't solving anything. They're avoiding. They're evading responsibility. They are using silence not as space for reflection, but as a weapon to assert dominance. It's a form of passive-aggressive behavior that shifts the emotional burden entirely onto the other person. Now you're the one left feeling anxious, guilty, and uncertain, even if you weren't the one who caused the conflict. It becomes emotional blackmail without a single word spoken. You're left in a maze with no map, expected to find your way back to peace while the other person holds the key. The silent treatment differs from healthy, temporary distance. Everyone needs space sometimes. Taking time to cool down, reflect, or process emotions is natural and often necessary. The difference lies in the intention. Healthy space involves communication and mutual understanding. You might hear, "I need a bit of time to think, but we'll talk soon." That's respectful. That's adult. The silent treatment, however, offers no such clarity. It's abrupt. It's cold. It offers no roadmap for return. It leaves you in the dark, expecting you to fumble your way toward reconciliation without knowing what you're even apologizing for. In many cases, the silent treatment creates a power imbalance in the relationship. One person assumes the role of emotional gatekeeper, deciding when connection is granted and when it's denied. The other is left on edge, trying to guess the rules, decode the silence, and earn their way back into emotional safety. It becomes a dance of compliance. You start to censor yourself, avoid conflict, and walk on eggshells, not because you've grown, but because you fear the cold shoulder that follows any disagreement. In this way, the silent treatment becomes a form of control dressed in the quiet cloak of restraint. Over time, the effects of the silent treatment can be deeply damaging. You may begin to internalize the idea that your voice doesn't matter. You might start believing that any emotional disturbance is your fault. The fear of silence can become more intense than the fear of confrontation, so you shrink your needs, suppress your opinions, and stay small just to avoid being shut out again. This self-silencing erodes your self-esteem, chips away at your emotional health, and creates a cycle where the manipulative behavior continues unchecked because you're too afraid to challenge it. Silent treatment can also be used strategically to punish without accountability. The person who goes silent gets to play the victim. distancing themselves while leaving you feeling like the aggressor. If you try to call it out, they may say, "I just didn't feel like talking," or "You're making a big deal out of nothing." And so you're gaslit into thinking that your hurt is irrational. They get to hurt you and deny it at the same time. That's the cruel brilliance of the tactic. It leaves no evidence, no raised voices, no proof. But it causes real wounds, just invisible ones. In romantic relationships, the silent treatment can be especially toxic. It replaces intimacy with isolation. Instead of talking through challenges, one partner disappears emotionally. And while the absence may not be physical, it is deeply felt. You lie beside someone who won't look at you, eat meals in silence, or watch them scroll their phone like you're not even in the room. This kind of emotional abandonment feels like being ghosted inside your own home. It doesn't just hurt. It erodes the sense of partnership, replacing it with a sense of loneliness that's even more painful because it exists in such close proximity to someone you care about. Healing from the silent treatment begins with recognizing it for what it is, not a sign of maturity or calmness, but a manipulation tactic designed to control and punish. You deserve communication, even in conflict. You deserve connection that doesn't disappear the moment you express something inconvenient. When someone repeatedly uses silence as a weapon, you are not obligated to play their game. You are allowed to step back, set boundaries, and say, "I'm open to a conversation, but I won't chase you through silence." It also means valuing your own voice. The antidote to the silent treatment isn't shouting. It's clarity. It's emotional boundaries. It's learning to sit with the discomfort of someone's withdrawal without internalizing it as your fault. You can't force someone to talk. But you can choose how long you're willing to wait. You can choose not to shrink yourself in hopes of ending their silence. And in that choice, you reclaim your agency. In the end, the silent treatment isn't about quiet. It's about control. But your peace does not depend on someone else's silence. It depends on your willingness to stand firmly in your truth, even when the room is silent. You deserve relationships where issues are addressed, not avoided. Where communication flows, not freezes. Where your voice is heard, not ignored. And if someone insists on using silence as punishment, you have every right to walk toward a life where silence is sacred, not strategic. Projection is one of the most common psychological defense mechanisms, yet one of the least recognized in everyday life. It slips into our relationships, conversations, and conflicts, often unnoticed. At its core, projection is when someone takes their own thoughts, feelings, or behaviors, especially the ones they find unacceptable or uncomfortable, and attributes them to someone else. It's like holding up a mirror to their inner world and insisting that the reflection is yours. And while it might offer the person a brief escape from guilt or self-awareness, it can quietly damage the people and relationships around them. Imagine someone who feels deeply insecure about their own worth. Instead of confronting that insecurity, they accuse others of thinking they're not good enough. They say things like, "I know you look down on me," or "You probably think I'm a failure," even when no such judgment has been expressed. What they're really doing is projecting their internal dialogue outward. They're taking the harsh voice in their own mind and assigning it to the people around them. In doing so, they avoid facing the discomfort of self-doubt by making it someone else's burden to carry. Projection is often subtle. It can show up as suspicion, accusations, or defensiveness. Someone who is unfaithful in a relationship may constantly accuse their partner of cheating. A person who harbors resentment may claim others are being passive-aggressive. A parent struggling with guilt might insist their child is ungrateful, even if the child has expressed nothing but love. These reactions don't come from reality. They come from internal discomfort displaced onto another person. And for the one on the receiving end, it can feel confusing, disorienting, and unfair. You're being blamed for emotions or actions that aren't yours to begin with. This kind of manipulation is rarely intentional in the beginning. Projection often happens unconsciously. The person doing it might genuinely believe that their accusations are valid. That's what makes projection so difficult to confront. It feels real to the one projecting. They're not necessarily lying. They're reacting to their inner world as though it's being created by the outside world. But just because someone believes their story doesn't mean you have to accept it as truth. Learning to recognize projection allows you to protect your emotional clarity and prevent someone else's issues from becoming your responsibility. One of the most dangerous aspects of projection is how it distorts communication. It turns genuine dialogue into a minefield. You try to express a concern, and suddenly you're being told you're the one with the issue. You say you feel hurt, and you're accused of being too sensitive. You attempt to set a boundary, and you're labeled selfish or controlling. The original conversation disappears, replaced by a defensive storm. And unless you're aware of what's happening, you may start to believe the distortions. You may start questioning your own intentions, wondering if maybe you are the problem. In intimate relationships, projection can be especially corrosive. One partner might accuse the other of being distant when they are the one withdrawing. Or they might claim the other is constantly critical when in fact they're the one judging harshly, both themselves and others. These dynamics can create a constant loop of miscommunication and blame. The more you try to explain or defend yourself, the deeper you get entangled in the other person's unresolved emotions. It's like trying to clean a mirror that keeps fogging up. You never get a clear view, no matter how hard you try. Projection also shows up in family relationships. Parents who feel guilt or regret about their own past choices may project disappointment onto their children. Instead of acknowledging their own pain, they claim the child is rebellious, lazy, or ungrateful. In reality, the child might just be living a different life, one that stirs up unresolved emotions in the parent. The result is often a cycle of shame and conflict, where the child feels constantly misunderstood and pressured to carry emotional weight that isn't theirs. And unless the pattern is recognized, it can repeat across generations. In friendships or workplaces, projection can manifest as gossip, micromanagement, or misplaced anger. A colleague who struggles with feelings of inadequacy might constantly critique others. A friend who is afraid of being judged might overanalyze every interaction and accuse others of being fake or distant. These projections are masks, worn to avoid vulnerability. But they often cause the very isolation and distrust the person fears. Over time, those around them may start pulling away. Not because of any real flaw, but because the constant misattribution of emotions becomes emotionally exhausting. One of the most powerful ways to protect yourself from projection is to stay grounded in self-awareness. When someone accuses you of something that doesn't align with your reality, pause before responding. Ask yourself, does this truly reflect me, or could it be coming from their internal world? Projection loses power when you stop accepting ownership of emotions that don't belong to you. You're not required to absorb every criticism, every accusation, every distorted story someone places at your feet. You are allowed to set boundaries, to say, "That doesn't feel like mine," and to walk away from misplaced blame. Healing from projection. Whether you're the one projecting or the one being projected onto, requires courage. For the person doing the projecting, it means turning inward and facing the emotions they've been trying to avoid. It means acknowledging the parts of themselves they've labeled as too shameful or scary to accept. It's not easy, but growth never is. And for those on the receiving end, healing means releasing the guilt that comes from being blamed for someone else's pain. It means returning their emotional baggage to its rightful owner and reaffirming your own emotional truth. Projection doesn't make someone a bad person. It makes them a person in pain. It's a defense mechanism born from the need to protect the ego from discomfort. But left unchecked, it becomes a destructive habit. The good news is that once it's recognized, it can be addressed. With self-awareness, therapy, and emotional honesty, people can learn to own their feelings instead of outsourcing them. They can learn to speak their truth without turning it into a weapon. In the end, projection is a mirror. One that doesn't show you your own reflection, but someone else's pain. You're allowed to acknowledge it without confusing it for your own. You're allowed to listen with empathy without losing your clarity. And most importantly, you're allowed to step back and remember that not everything that's thrown at you is meant for you to catch. Some things are simply being released by others in ways they don't yet know how to control. Triangulation is a subtle but highly manipulative tactic that quietly reshapes relationships, often without anyone realizing what's happening. Until it's too late. It involves bringing a third party into a two-person conflict or dynamic in order to gain an advantage, deflect responsibility, or control the narrative. Instead of addressing issues directly with the person involved, the manipulator recruits someone else to serve as an ally, a buffer, or even a weapon. It becomes less about resolution and more about reinforcement. Triangulation divides people, turns communication sideways, and sows confusion, mistrust, and resentment where clarity could have taken root. In its simplest form, triangulation occurs when one person talks about another behind their back instead of addressing them directly. For example, a friend might be upset with you, but instead of speaking to you, they vent to a mutual friend. That mutual friend now becomes involved, either by choice or by manipulation, and may be used to relay messages, form opinions, or influence outcomes. The original conflict is now obscured by the addition of a third party who may not fully understand the situation. The result? Miscommunication spreads, sides are chosen, and emotional distance grows. In more toxic dynamics, triangulation is used deliberately to control and divide. A parent might pit two siblings against each other by praising one while criticizing the other in private. A manager might share conflicting information with employees, then stand back and watch the tension unfold. A romantic partner might bring in an ex or a friend to create jealousy or insecurity. These tactics are not random. They're strategic. The manipulator uses triangulation to maintain a position of control, always remaining at the center while others spin around them in confusion and conflict. What makes triangulation so effective and damaging is that it often masquerades as concern or harmless venting. The manipulator might say, "I just needed to talk to someone," or "I was worried, so I told them what you said." But this bypasses direct communication and creates emotional alliances that leave the targeted person isolated. Over time, it corrodes trust. You begin to question who you can talk to, whether your words are safe, and if you're being misrepresented. The environment becomes emotionally unsafe. Not because of open hostility, but because of quiet, persistent betrayal. Triangulation often thrives in environments where direct communication is discouraged or avoided. In families, especially, it can become a generational pattern. Children grow up watching their parents talk about each other to third parties rather than speaking to one another. They learn that honesty leads to confrontation, while indirectness keeps things smooth. At least temporarily. But the long-term result is emotional fragmentation. No one feels truly seen or heard. Everyone feels slightly betrayed. And the lines between truth, perception, and manipulation become increasingly blurred. In romantic relationships, triangulation can be especially damaging. One partner may use a friend, an ex, or even a child to create distance or provoke jealousy. They might say things like, "So-and-so thinks you're overreacting," or "I was talking to my friend, and they agree with me. You're being unreasonable." In these moments, the relationship dynamic shifts. It's no longer a private space for mutual understanding. It becomes a stage where outside opinions are used to invalidate, pressure, or confuse. And instead of working through issues together, the focus turns to defending yourself against a third party who isn't even in the room. The effects of triangulation are often felt long before they are fully understood. You might find yourself feeling uneasy around certain people without knowing why. You might start doubting your instincts or second-guessing your version of events. If enough people seem to be siding against you, or echoing things you never said, you may begin to internalize the idea that you're the problem. That's the dangerous beauty of triangulation. It doesn't just divide people. It quietly alters their perception of reality. And if you don't recognize it, it can leave you emotionally isolated, misunderstood, and easier to manipulate. One of the hardest parts of being on the receiving end of triangulation is the sense of powerlessness it creates. When someone talks about you instead of to you, you're denied the chance to speak for yourself. Your side of the story goes unheard. Your feelings go unacknowledged. And the people around you may form opinions based on half-truths or deliberate distortions. It's emotional exile. And it's often done by someone who knows exactly what they're doing. But not all triangulation is calculated. Sometimes it stems from fear. Fear of confrontation, fear of rejection, or fear of vulnerability. Instead of dealing with those emotions directly, people look for validation elsewhere. They collect allies rather than have hard conversations. But the result is the same: broken trust, confusion, and emotional distance. And whether it's done consciously or unconsciously, the harm it causes is very real. Breaking the pattern of triangulation requires courage and clarity. It means choosing direct communication over triangulated messaging. If someone brings you into a conflict that doesn't involve you, you can say, "I think this is something you need to talk to them about directly." If you feel tempted to talk about someone instead of to them, pause and ask yourself why. Are you avoiding discomfort? Are you looking for validation? Or are you trying to control the narrative? Healthy communication is a triangle with only 2 points. It involves direct, honest, and respectful dialogue between the people actually involved. It doesn't pull in outsiders as judges, referees, or emotional dumping grounds. And it doesn't use third parties as tools of manipulation or shields against accountability. When you remove the third point, the relationship either stands on its own, or it reveals the fractures that were already there. If you've been targeted by triangulation, your power lies in staying grounded in your truth. You don't have to participate in someone else's emotional triangle. You don't have to defend yourself to people who were never meant to be involved. And you don't have to chase after distorted stories to correct them. You can choose clarity. You can choose boundaries. And you can choose to step out of the triangle altogether. Triangulation is a tactic of the insecure, the controlling, and the emotionally avoidant. It may succeed in the short term, but it always leaves emotional wreckage in its wake. The antidote is presence. Choosing to deal with people directly, to stand in truth rather than behind whispers. Because real connection doesn't need sides. It just needs honesty. Blame shifting is the emotional art of passing the buck, a subtle yet damaging tactic where someone avoids taking responsibility for their own behavior by redirecting the blame onto others. At first glance, It may seem like a momentary lapse in accountability, but when it becomes a pattern, blame shifting turns into a form of manipulation that corrodes trust, distorts reality, and slowly dismantles healthy communication. It creates confusion in the person being blamed and gives the blamer an escape hatch from accountability. Over time, the relationship becomes one-sided, with one person always apologizing and the other always excusing. This tactic often begins in everyday situations. Small moments where an error occurs, a promise is broken, or a feeling is hurt. Rather than saying, "I'm sorry, I messed up," the blame shifter turns the situation around. They might say, "Well, if you hadn't distracted me, I wouldn't have forgotten," or, "You're just too sensitive. I didn't mean it like that." Instead of reflecting inward, they reflect outward. The spotlight is never on them. It's always redirected to someone else's actions, tone, timing, or reaction. And what might have been a moment of mutual understanding becomes a clouded exchange where the real issue never gets resolved. The danger of blame shifting lies in how quickly it can erode your confidence. When someone consistently shifts the blame, it forces you to question your perceptions and second-guess your feelings. You may start to wonder if you are overreacting, if you really are the one causing problems, or if you should have approached things differently. This internal confusion can lead to an unhealthy pattern where you begin accepting blame just to keep the peace, even when deep down, you know the situation wasn't your fault. You become the emotional filter through which their mistakes pass, cleaned of discomfort before being handed back to them. Blame shifting is especially damaging in close relationships because it rewires the emotional dynamics. One person becomes the permanent fixer, the peacemaker, the one who always bends, while the other becomes immune to growth. Instead of learning from their behavior, the blame shifter reinforces it by avoiding consequences. They keep their self-image intact by placing the emotional burden on someone else. And the more often this occurs, the more one-sided the relationship becomes. Conversations are no longer mutual exchanges. They're performances where one person deflects and the other absorbs. In some cases, blame shifting is used as a defense mechanism. People who blame shift may do so out of fear. Fear of judgment, failure, vulnerability, or being seen as flawed. Admitting fault feels too threatening, so they shift it elsewhere. But even if it's not always conscious or malicious, the impact remains the same. The person on the receiving end is still left carrying a weight that doesn't belong to them. The intent may soften the action, but it doesn't erase the emotional toll it takes over time. Blame shifting can also be used strategically to control narratives and manipulate perception. In workplace settings, a coworker might fail to complete a task and then claim you gave them the wrong information. In friendships, someone might lash out and then blame it on your negative energy or claim they were just reacting to your attitude. These are not random misunderstandings. They are carefully placed distortions meant to protect the blame shifter's ego at the cost of your peace. The worst part is how convincing it can all sound. If repeated often enough, even you might begin to believe it. A hallmark of blame shifting is the refusal to engage in honest, solution-based conversations. When confronted, the blame shifter diverts, distracts, or becomes defensive. They might bring up unrelated past events to confuse the issue. They might highlight your flaws to justify their own. Or they might claim victimhood, turning your attempt at resolution into an attack. These tactics create emotional chaos, making it difficult to hold them accountable or find common ground. It becomes less about solving the problem and more about dodging responsibility. Over time, this dynamic can deeply affect your mental and emotional well-being. You might start over-explaining yourself, apologizing when you haven't done anything wrong, or keeping your concerns to yourself just to avoid conflict. You may begin feeling emotionally depleted, anxious, or like you're walking on eggshells. Your sense of fairness starts to fade, replaced by quiet resignation. And that's the ultimate cost of blame shifting. It doesn't just fracture communication, it fractures self-trust. But recognizing blame shifting is the first step toward healing. It begins with noticing the patterns. Does someone in your life always seem to find a way to make things your fault? Do conversations about their behavior always turn into discussions about your tone, timing, or delivery? Do you often leave discussions feeling guilty when you were the one initially hurt? These are signs that you may be on the receiving end of blame shifting. And acknowledging that doesn't make you confrontational. It makes you aware. Setting boundaries is essential when dealing with a habitual blame shifter. You can calmly point out the deflection and bring the conversation back to the issue at hand. For example, I understand that you're upset, but I'd like to focus on what happened and how we can address it, can help steer the conversation toward accountability. It also sends a clear message: I see the game, and I won't play it. You don't need to convince them or win the argument. You only need to stay grounded in your truth and not take responsibility for things you didn't do. It's also important to give yourself permission to step back. If someone consistently refuses to take responsibility for their actions, you are not obligated to stay in a loop of emotional labor. Healthy relationships require two people willing to own their part, grow, and work through challenges together. If you find yourself always being the one who bends, apologizes, or fixes things, the relationship is not balanced. You deserve fairness, honesty, and mutual respect. Blame shifting thrives in silence, in the spaces where people are too exhausted, confused, or afraid to speak up. But when you name it, when you say, "This isn't mine to carry," something shifts. The fog begins to clear. The emotional weight lifts. And you begin to reclaim your power. You don't have to absorb someone else's fear, shame, or avoidance. You are allowed to place the blame back where it belongs and walk away lighter, clearer, and free. In the end, blame shifting is not about you. It's about someone else's refusal to face themselves. You are not their mirror, their scapegoat, or their emotional sponge. You are a person deserving of accountability, clarity, and respect. Let their blame fall flat. Let their distortions dissolve. You don't need to carry what was never yours. Minimization is a quiet kind of manipulation, often disguised as calmness, perspective, or even humor. At its surface, it might seem like someone is simply trying to ease tension or lighten the mood. But beneath that polished exterior lies a pattern of dismissing the feelings, experiences, or needs of others in subtle and disarming ways. It's not as loud as shouting or as aggressive as blame. It's the quiet shrug of "it's not a big deal," or the casual tone of "you're making a mountain out of a molehill." It's emotional erasure by way of understatement. The essence of minimization is this: it downplays reality. When someone minimizes, they invalidate what another person is feeling or experiencing by reducing its importance. This can happen in a variety of contexts. Romantic relationships, families, workplaces, and friendships. You might try to express hurt or discomfort, only to be met with phrases like "you're too sensitive," "that's not what I meant," or "it wasn't that serious." These responses don't just deny your feelings. They shrink them down to something insignificant. Over time, you begin to doubt whether your reactions are valid at all. What makes minimization so difficult to challenge is that it's wrapped in plausible deniability. The person doing it often presents themselves as reasonable, even caring. They might say, "I didn't mean to upset you," or "I just think you're overthinking it." And in the moment, those statements can sound rational. But rationality isn't the issue. Dismissal is. It's not about whether they meant to cause harm. It's about the fact that your hurt is being diminished instead of acknowledged. Your emotional truth is being traded for their intellectual convenience. In many cases, minimization stems from emotional discomfort. The person doing it may not know how to handle strong emotions, either their own or someone else's. Instead of leaning into the discomfort of empathy or vulnerability, they retreat into denial, often sugar-coated with phrases meant to sound soothing. It's not worth getting upset about, they might say, believing they're helping. But help that invalidates is not help at all. It's a mask for avoidance. It's a way of saying, your feelings are too much for me to deal with, so I'll pretend they don't matter. Minimization is also a tool for maintaining control in relationships. If someone can convince you that your concerns are overreactions, they no longer need to change their behavior. If your anger is exaggerated, then their actions don't need examination. It becomes a subtle power play. You bring up something that matters, and they shrink it until it feels like it never mattered at all. It's a way of turning the spotlight away from their behavior and placing it on your supposed emotional instability. One of the most damaging aspects of minimization is its impact on self-perception. Over time, people on the receiving end begin to internalize the message that their feelings are excessive, irrational, or burdensome. They learn to shrink themselves before someone else does. They stop speaking up, not because they're no longer hurt, but because they've been taught their pain is too small to matter. They adapt by suppressing, smiling, or apologizing for even minor emotional reactions. And in doing so, they lose the ability to advocate for themselves clearly and confidently. In families, minimization can begin early. A child cries after being hurt and is told, "Stop being dramatic." A teen expresses sadness and is met with, "Other people have it worse." These are phrases often meant to build resilience. But they can also teach shame. They imply that expressing pain is a weakness or an inconvenience. And so, many grow into adults who second-guess their emotions and default to downplaying what they feel, even when they're deeply affected. The message they carry is simple but heavy: don't feel too much, or you'll be dismissed. In romantic relationships, minimization can erode emotional intimacy. Vulnerability requires safety. When one partner consistently minimizes the other's emotions, the relationship loses its sense of sanctuary. The minimized partner learns that sharing too much, too often, or too intensely will be met with rolled eyes, sighs, or sarcastic remarks. The space that should feel safe becomes a place of quiet rejection. And even when love is present, its expression becomes conditional. Safe only when kept small, manageable, and easy to ignore. In workplaces, minimization often takes the form of subtle dismissals. Concerns about overwork are labeled as complaints. Reports of discomfort are brushed off with comments like, "It's just part of the job." When leadership minimizes, it creates a culture where problems are hidden rather than solved. People stop bringing issues forward. They adapt, they stay silent, and they endure. But under the surface, morale deteriorates. Minimization doesn't just affect individuals. It affects environments. It teaches people that their discomfort is not just irrelevant, but inconvenient to those in power. So how do you recognize minimization when it's happening? Start by tuning into how you feel after vulnerable conversations. Do you often leave feeling unheard, foolish, or overreactive? Do you find yourself apologizing for being emotional? Do you hesitate before sharing concerns because you expect them to be dismissed? These are red flags. Minimization doesn't always come with obvious harm, but it consistently leaves people feeling smaller than when they walked in. Responding to minimization requires clarity and confidence. It means standing firm in your emotional truth, even when someone else tries to shrink it. You can say, "I hear that you see it differently, but this is still important to me," or "I'm not overreacting. This matters, and I need you to take it seriously." It's not about proving your feelings are valid. They already are. It's about refusing to let someone else rewrite your emotional reality. Boundaries are also essential. If someone repeatedly minimizes your feelings despite your efforts to communicate clearly, you have every right to step back. Emotional safety is not a luxury. It's a necessity in any healthy relationship. You are not too sensitive. You are not too much. You are simply asking for what every person deserves, to be heard, seen, and taken seriously. In the end, minimization is not about making things better. It's about making things easier for the person who doesn't want to feel uncomfortable. But discomfort is a part of empathy, growth, and connection. When someone chooses to meet you in that space rather than shrink it, healing begins. Until then, your job is not to make your pain palatable. Your job is to honor it, speak it, and hold it as real. Because it is. Passive aggression is the quiet thunder of unresolved tension. It's a way of expressing anger, resentment, or frustration without ever saying so directly. Instead of open confrontation, passive aggression hides behind sarcasm, silence, forgetfulness, or subtle sabotage. It masks hostility in a smile, buries resentment in polite tones, and turns communication into a maze of indirect clues and unspoken grievances. You're left trying to decode the tension in the room, sensing something is wrong, but being told everything is fine. It's a form of emotional warfare disguised as politeness. At the heart of passive aggression is avoidance. Specifically, the avoidance of honest expression. People who communicate this way often fear conflict, vulnerability, or rejection. So rather than speak their truth, they cloak it in behaviors that allow them to express discontent without taking responsibility for it. A missed call is not returned. A text is left unread. A task is suddenly forgotten, even though it was important to you. These are not random mistakes. They're statements, delivered without words. And the message is clear: I'm upset with you, but I won't say it out loud. The most frustrating part of dealing with passive aggression is the gaslighting effect it creates. You sense the hostility. You feel the coldness. You hear the tone. But when you bring it up, you're often met with denial. "I was just joking," they might say, or "You're reading too much into it." You're made to feel foolish for noticing what your instincts clearly picked up on. And over time, this chips away at your confidence. You begin to question whether you're imagining things, whether you're being too sensitive, or whether you're the one creating tension that didn't exist. Passive aggression can show up in many forms, some more obvious than others. Sarcasm is one of its most recognizable faces. A smile paired with a cutting remark, a joke that's just sharp enough to hurt, but soft enough to be denied. "Oh, of course you're too busy to help again," might be said with a laugh, but underneath it lies real frustration. Then there's procrastination. Agreeing to do something and intentionally dragging it out to express resentment. Or the silent treatment. Pretending everything is fine while withholding affection, communication, or cooperation. These behaviors all carry a message: I'm not happy, and I want you to feel it without me ever having to admit it. In relationships, passive aggression becomes especially toxic because it replaces connection with confusion. You never know where you stand. One day things seem fine, and the next you're met with indifference, clipped answers, or half-hearted effort. You try to talk about the problem, but the conversation slides sideways. They don't want to talk about it. They're not mad. You're overreacting. And so the issue lingers in the air like a storm that never breaks. You're left trying to repair something that hasn't even been acknowledged as broken. What makes passive aggression so difficult to navigate is that it operates on plausible deniability. Because it's indirect, the person using it can always backtrack. If you confront them, they can claim you misunderstood. If you express hurt, they can dismiss you. They get to offload their emotions without ever owning them. It's like trying to hold water in your hands. There's nothing solid to grab onto. And that's the point. Passive aggression isn't about resolution. It's about emotional control without accountability. In friendships, passive aggression often reveals itself in subtle jabs or backhanded compliments. Must be nice to have all that free time might be a friend's way of saying they feel neglected. But instead of expressing that directly, they dress it up in a comment that sounds harmless on the surface. In family dynamics, it can show up as conditional support. Help that's given with a side of guilt, or love that's offered with quiet resentment. In workplaces, it can take the form of vague emails, excluded meetings, or coworkers who nod politely in person but undermine behind the scenes. The common thread in all of these interactions is emotional dishonesty. Passive aggression breaks down trust because it creates a landscape where nothing can be spoken plainly. You're left to infer tone, interpret silence, and read between the lines. Over time, this erodes emotional safety. You stop bringing up concerns, not because you're at peace, but because you're tired of the dance. And the relationship, though outwardly intact, becomes hollow, void of openness, vulnerability, or true connection. For the person who uses passive aggression, the behavior is often rooted in learned habits. They may have grown up in environments where expressing anger was unsafe or met with punishment. They may have been taught that being nice is more important than being honest. Or they may simply lack the emotional tools to express themselves directly. But understanding the roots of passive aggression doesn't make it any easier to live with. Empathy can coexist with boundaries. You can acknowledge someone's pain while refusing to tolerate behavior that makes you question your reality. The first step in addressing passive aggression is recognizing it for what it is, a form of emotional avoidance. It's not just someone having a bad day. It's not just sarcasm. It's a pattern of behavior that replaces honesty with hostility in disguise. If you're on the receiving end, you're allowed to name it. You can say, "I feel like there's tension. Can we talk about it?" Or when you say that, it feels like you're upset. Is something going on? You may be met with resistance or denial. That's okay. The goal isn't to force openness. It's to set a standard of clarity. Boundaries are essential when dealing with passive aggression. You are not responsible for decoding someone else's silence, sarcasm, or emotional games. You can choose not to engage with it. You can choose to step back from relationships that require constant emotional guesswork. Healthy communication is not a luxury. It's a requirement for meaningful connection. And if someone consistently refuses to engage in it, you're allowed to protect your peace. If you recognize passive aggression in yourself, it's a chance to grow. Ask yourself why expressing your feelings directly feels so difficult. What are you afraid will happen if you say what you really mean? Passive aggression is often the language of the emotionally starved. People who have never been taught that their feelings are valid, or who fear rejection so deeply that they'd rather suffer in silence than risk being misunderstood. But indirect communication never gets your needs met. It only guarantees misunderstanding. And you deserve to be heard, not just hinted at. In the end, passive aggression may look like quiet resistance, but it creates loud chaos. It keeps people guessing, distances them emotionally, and replaces intimacy with tension. Real strength lies in vulnerability. The courage to say, "I'm hurt, I'm angry," or "I need something to change." When you speak your truth clearly and kindly, you invite others to do the same. And in that space, relationships don't just survive. They deepen, strengthen, and finally breathe. Negging is one of the more cunning forms of manipulation, a subtle and calculated tactic that disguises insult as flirtation, criticism as connection. On the surface, it might seem like a playful tease, a quirky comment meant to grab your attention. But underneath that thin veil lies a strategy designed to chip away at self-esteem in order to gain power, often in romantic or social dynamics. It's not just an offhand joke or a snarky remark. It's emotional conditioning dressed in charm. At its core, negging is a backhanded compliment that stings more than it soothes. It's the kind of comment that leaves you slightly off balance, unsure whether to feel flattered or offended. Someone might say, "You'd be really pretty if you lost a few pounds," or "You're actually smarter than I expected." These aren't compliments. They're subtle put-downs meant to create self-doubt. The goal isn't to uplift you. It's to destabilize your confidence just enough that you begin to seek validation from the person who criticized you in the first place. What makes negging particularly insidious is its subtlety. It's rarely direct or overt. It comes wrapped in a smile, softened by humor, or veiled in concern. The person negging you might insist they're just being honest or just joking. And if you react, they may accuse you of being too sensitive or not being able to take a joke. This creates a psychological trap. You begin to question whether your hurt feelings are valid or whether you're simply overreacting. And once that doubt sets in, the power begins to shift in their favor. Negging operates on a principle of emotional disruption. By introducing a subtle criticism or insult, the manipulator interrupts your emotional balance. If you're confident, they challenge that confidence. If you're calm, they stir discomfort. The aim is to create a moment of vulnerability, however small, that they can then use to forge a false sense of connection. You start looking to them for reassurance, for affirmation, for approval. In this way, negging establishes a dynamic where the manipulator becomes the emotional authority, the one who defines your worth. Often used in the dating world, negging is a tactic popularized by so-called pickup artist culture. The logic behind it is simple but disturbing. If you lower someone's self-esteem, they'll become more eager to gain your approval. So instead of genuine compliments, the manipulator offers calculated jabs. Instead of real connection, they offer confusion wrapped in flirtation. It's not about getting to know you. It's about gaining control over how you feel about yourself. The more uncertain you become, the more powerful they feel. But negging doesn't just show up in romantic settings. It can occur in friendships, workplaces, and family dynamics too. A friend might say, "You're really brave for wearing that outfit," implying that it's a bad choice. A coworker might remark, "I'm surprised you actually pulled that off," casting doubt on your competence while pretending to admire you. A family member might tell you, "You were always the weird one, but I guess it's worked out for you." These comments are not harmless. They are designed to make you question yourself while keeping the speaker in a position of subtle dominance. The long-term effect of negging is erosion. Little by little, these offhand comments begin to wear down your self-image. You may not notice it at first. You may even laugh along, brush it off, or pretend it doesn't bother you. But internally, the seeds of insecurity are planted. You might start dressing differently, speaking more cautiously, or doubting your own opinions. You begin to adjust not because you want to, but because you're being subtly conditioned to believe you should. That's the slow power of negging. It doesn't break you all at once. It chips away, piece by piece. For the person doing the nagging, this tactic often stems from insecurity masked as confidence. They may struggle with vulnerability, so instead of building real intimacy, they use control. They feel powerful not by being admired, but by being needed. Especially by someone who begins to look to them for self-worth. It's a counterfeit form of influence. They may believe they're charming or clever, but what they're really doing is creating dependency through psychological manipulation. And they often rely on plausible deniability to continue. If confronted, they shrug it off. Relax, they say. Don't take everything so seriously. But recognizing nagging for what it is can be incredibly empowering. Once you see the tactic clearly, you no longer have to internalize its effects. That backhanded compliment? It's not about you. It's about them. That subtle dig disguised as flirtation? It's not playful. It's manipulative. You are not obligated to absorb insults just because they're wrapped in charm. You are allowed to name it, to step away from it, to protect your self-esteem without explanation. You are not too sensitive for reacting. You are sensitive because you're aware. And awareness is strength. If you suspect you're being nagged, listen to your body's cues. Do you feel suddenly self-conscious around someone who claims to like you? Do you find yourself trying to prove your worth after spending time with them? Do you leave conversations feeling smaller than when you walked in? These are signs that something is off. Trust that inner voice. You don't need anyone who builds attraction by making you feel less than. Real connection doesn't come from criticism. It comes from curiosity, kindness, and respect. Responding to nagging can be as simple as disengaging. You don't need to argue, prove a point, or offer a counter-insult. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. A quiet refusal to play the game. If you do choose to speak up, you might say something like, "That didn't feel like a compliment," or "I'd prefer if you spoke to me respectfully." If their charm crumbles at the first sign of accountability, that tells you everything you need to know. True connection doesn't require anyone to feel small in order for someone else to feel big. In the end, nagging is not flirtation. It's manipulation. It thrives on confusion, doubt, and misplaced validation. But the moment you recognize it, you begin to take your power back. You realize that you don't need to win over someone who makes you feel inadequate. You don't need to prove your worth to anyone who tries to dim your light just so theirs can shine brighter. You are already worthy. Already enough. Already whole. And anyone who doesn't see that doesn't deserve a place in your heart, your mind, or your life. Playing the victim is one of the most deceptive and draining forms of emotional manipulation. On the surface, it can look like someone who's merely hurt, misunderstood, or dealing with difficult circumstances. But underneath, it's a calculated strategy designed to avoid responsibility, gain sympathy, and control the narrative. Instead of owning their part in a conflict or accepting the natural consequences of their actions, the person playing the victim shifts the focus entirely to their own pain. Whether real, exaggerated, or invented. The result is that others begin to feel guilty, even when they've done nothing wrong. The core function of this behavior is emotional diversion. When someone plays the victim, they redirect attention away from the issue at hand and instead create a new storyline where they are the one who's been wronged. You could confront them about a clear mistake, an inconsiderate act, or harmful behavior, and suddenly, you find yourself comforting them, apologizing, or questioning your own judgment. It's no longer about what they did. It's about how they feel. This flips the emotional script and places them at the center of attention, often leaving the actual victim on the outside, unheard and unseen. One of the key signs that someone is playing the victim is that nothing ever seems to be their fault. No matter the situation, someone else is always to blame. Their boss is out to get them. Their friends are too demanding. Their ex was abusive. While it's certainly true that people experience real pain and injustice, someone who chronically plays the victim never reflects on their own contribution to the pattern. They rarely ask, "What role did I play in this?" Instead, they cast themselves as the permanent underdog, surrounded by enemies, adversity, or unfairness that no one else seems to understand. What makes this tactic so manipulative is that it exploits our natural empathy. Most of us want to help others when they're struggling. We're wired to respond with compassion to someone who seems vulnerable or distressed. The person playing the victim knows this and uses it to their advantage. They may cry, sigh deeply, bring up their difficult past, or remind you of all they've suffered. And while some of that may be true, it's the way it's used that reveals the intent. Not to heal or to connect, but to control, deflect, or manipulate the situation in their favor. In relationships, this behavior can be especially corrosive. Imagine trying to have a serious conversation with a partner about something that hurt you, only for them to respond with, "I guess I can't do anything right," or "Why are you always picking on me?" Instead of listening, they collapse emotionally. And now, instead of discussing the issue, you're comforting them. You've been emotionally redirected. This reversal not only invalidates your concerns but subtly trains you to stop bringing things up in the future. Over time, you become silent, not because the relationship is peaceful, but because you've learned that honesty leads to guilt, not resolution. In families, playing the victim often shows up in cycles. A parent may guilt their adult children into compliance by highlighting everything they sacrificed. A sibling might stir drama and then claim to be targeted when consequences follow. These dynamics are hard to break because they're often wrapped in the language of love and obligation. "After all I've done for you," they'll say, as if love should exempt them from accountability. But love without responsibility is not love. It's leverage. And people who constantly play the victim use this leverage to manipulate relationships into one-sided arrangements where their needs always come first. Playing the victim can also appear in workplaces and friendships. A coworker might avoid deadlines and then blame others for not supporting them. A friend might start drama and then say, "I'm just always the one who gets left out." These comments seem harmless, even pitiful at first, but they carry a manipulative undercurrent. They're designed to pull you into emotional labor. Offering reassurance, doing damage control, or feeling responsible for someone else's inability to face their own actions. And if you try to call it out, they may double down, "Wow, I can't believe you're attacking me right now." It's a strategy that makes criticism feel like cruelty and honesty feel like betrayal. The longer you deal with someone who plays the victim, the more it wears you down. You may find yourself walking on emotional eggshells, trying not to trigger another breakdown. You may stop expressing your needs or setting boundaries because the backlash always feels heavier than it should. You may even start to question your own character, wondering if you really are too harsh, too demanding, or too insensitive. This is how the cycle sustains itself. The real victim ends up silenced, while the manipulator continues to play their role unchallenged, protected by the very sympathy they've worked so hard to solicit. It's important to recognize that playing the victim is not the same as being one. People can be deeply hurt. They can be mistreated, neglected, or misunderstood. But a true victim seeks healing, not control. They seek clarity, not chaos. Someone who's genuinely hurt wants to understand the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Someone who's playing the victim wants to control the truth so they don't have to face discomfort. That's the difference between vulnerability and manipulation. One seeks connection, the other seeks protection from accountability. So what can you do when you recognize this behavior? First, stay grounded in your reality. Don't let someone else's emotional performance convince you that your perspective is invalid. You have a right to express your needs, your concerns, and your truth, even if someone else finds that uncomfortable. Second, don't get pulled into the emotional tug-of-war. When someone redirects the conversation toward their pain, gently but firmly steer it back. I hear that you're upset, but I'd still like to talk about what happened. This keeps the focus on the issue without dismissing their feelings. Boundaries are essential. If someone consistently uses victimhood to avoid responsibility, you're not obligated to continue enabling it. You don't have to fix their emotions or rescue them from the consequences of their actions. Real growth only happens when people are allowed and required to face the truth about themselves. And sometimes, the most compassionate thing you can do is step back and let them do just that. In the end, playing the victim is about control disguised as helplessness. It can make you feel like the villain in your own story, twist your intentions, and drain your emotional energy. But the truth is simple: you are not responsible for someone else's refusal to grow. You are not cruel for asking for honesty. You are not unkind for setting a boundary. And you are not heartless for walking away from someone who insists on staying stuck in a narrative where everyone else is always to blame. Future faking is a subtle yet powerful form of emotional manipulation. It's when someone makes grand promises about the future. Commitments, plans, dreams. Not because they genuinely intend to follow through, but because they want to influence your present behavior. These promises are designed to hook you emotionally, to build trust quickly, and to secure your time, loyalty, or affection. But once you're invested, the future fades into the background, and the promises vanish like fog in sunlight. You're left wondering what happened, questioning your expectations, and feeling foolish for believing in a vision that was never meant to come true. The core of future faking lies in its intent. It's not about optimism or hope. It's about control. The manipulator creates a compelling fantasy filled with weddings, vacations, business plans, or shared dreams. They speak with conviction, making you feel like you're building something meaningful together. But behind the curtain, there's no real plan. There's no timeline, no follow-through, no structure. The promises are goals. They're tools. And those tools are used to secure your emotional investment in the moment, not to build a shared life in the long term. This tactic is particularly common in romantic relationships. A partner might say, "I can't wait for us to move in together," or "I've been thinking about starting a family with you," long before the relationship has reached that level of trust or stability. These statements may be followed by other emotionally charged language like, "You're the one I've been looking for," or "I've never felt this way about anyone." At first, it feels like a fairy tale. The intensity is thrilling. But eventually, the fantasy begins to crack. Deadlines pass. Conversations become vague. Plans are postponed again and again. And suddenly, you realize that the beautiful future they described was never rooted in reality. What makes future faking so hard to detect, especially early on, is that the words often sound sincere. There's a tone of passion, eye contact, maybe even tears. The person seems genuinely excited. But future faking isn't about emotional authenticity. It's about timing. It's about saying what needs to be said to get what they want now. Whether it's your trust, commitment, physical intimacy, or forgiveness, the promise of a shared future becomes a bargaining chip. And the more emotionally invested you become, the harder it is to see that you've been misled. Future faking is also common in toxic workplace environments. A boss might promise a raise, a promotion, or a leadership opportunity. Just not yet. Stick with me, and I'll make sure you get the recognition you deserve. You work harder, take on more responsibility, maybe even sacrifice your personal life in hopes of being rewarded later. But the promotion never comes. The role never materializes. And when you bring it up, you're told to be patient, to wait just a little longer, to keep proving yourself. The goalposts keep moving, and you begin to realize that the future you were working toward was nothing more than a motivational illusion. In friendships, future faking can look like someone who constantly talks about doing things together but never follows through. Let's take that trip this summer. I'm totally going to support your project. We should totally hang out more. These statements seem well-intentioned, but they often serve as social currency. A way to maintain closeness or ease tension without any real commitment. Over time, you begin to feel like the relationship is built on air. Words without weight, plans without purpose. The emotional impact of future faking is deep. It creates a cycle of anticipation followed by disappointment. You begin to invest your time, your energy, and your heart into a story that feels real. Until it doesn't. And when reality doesn't match the promises, you don't just feel let down. You feel misled. You may blame yourself for expecting too much, for being naive, or for believing too quickly. But the truth is, your hope wasn't the problem. The manipulation was. You believed in the future because someone made it feel tangible. They offered you a vision and asked you to believe. And you did. Because you trusted them. Future faking becomes even more damaging when it's used to excuse poor behavior. A partner might hurt you emotionally, break promises, or become distant. And when you confront them, they paint a picture of the future. Just wait until things settle down. We're going to get through this and be stronger than ever. These future-oriented statements are used as emotional band-aids to soothe your present pain without addressing the root cause. The illusion of a better tomorrow is dangled in front of you, just far enough to keep you holding on. But never close enough to become reality. What's most devastating is that future faking undermines trust. Not just in others, but in your own judgment. You begin to question your ability to tell the difference between sincerity and performance. You may even become hesitant to believe in the future at all, fearing that every promise is a trap. That emotional fallout can linger, affecting your ability to connect, commit, or dream. It creates emotional fatigue, a kind of quiet grief for the life you thought you were building. The key to recognizing future faking lies in watching actions, not just words. Promises are only as strong as the behavior that supports them. If someone constantly talks about the future but avoids taking steps toward it, that's a red flag. If every commitment comes with conditions, delays, or vagueness, it's worth examining. Healthy people don't just talk about the future. They invite you into it, day by day, with small, meaningful steps. They build trust through consistency, not fantasy. Responding to future faking requires clarity and boundaries. You can say, "I appreciate your vision, but I need to see action," or "I've noticed that we've talked about this a lot, but it never seems to happen." These aren't accusations. They're observations. And if someone truly values the relationship, they'll respond with maturity and follow-through, not defensiveness or more promises. If they continue spinning stories without results, you have every right to step back. Your time, your heart, and your dreams deserve to be honored, not manipulated. In the end, future faking is about false promises made with real consequences. It trades long-term connection for short-term gain. It confuses love with control, hope with bait, trust with leverage. But you are not foolish for believing in better. You are not wrong for wanting a future with someone. What matters is not that you hoped, but that you learned. You learned to listen for patterns, to watch for action, and to trust the future only when it's being built with care in the present. Stonewalling is a silent form of emotional resistance that can quietly dismantle a relationship over time. It doesn't involve shouting or arguing. It doesn't arrive with accusations or threats. Instead, it builds walls where there should be bridges. It shows up as cold silence, blank stares, one-word answers, or complete emotional shutdown. When someone stonewalls, they refuse to engage, respond, or participate in the conversation, especially when things get difficult. And while it may look like restraint or calm, it often feels like abandonment to the person on the receiving end. At its core, stonewalling is a refusal to connect. It's not about taking space to reflect. It's about removing oneself entirely from emotional responsibility. It might look like turning away during a conversation, avoiding eye contact, or using the excuse of being too tired or not in the mood to talk every time something important needs to be addressed. It may also come in the form of passive-aggressive silence after a disagreement, leaving the other person feeling punished without ever knowing exactly why. The issue doesn't get resolved. It gets buried beneath a layer of silence that slowly turns into resentment. What makes stonewalling particularly damaging is the confusion it creates. When someone stops responding, it forces the other person to carry the weight of both the silence and the problem. You're left guessing what went wrong, trying to interpret facial expressions or body language, replaying conversations in your head, and wondering if you're the one to blame. It's like shouting into a void. No echo, no feedback, just silence. And that silence, especially in close relationships, can feel more painful than words ever could. Unlike healthy space or cooling off periods, stonewalling offers no clarity, no communication, no closure. Healthy distance might sound like, "I need some time to cool down, but I'll talk to you soon." That kind of break is rooted in respect and emotional regulation. Stonewalling, on the other hand, is marked by emotional withdrawal without explanation. It's about creating distance not to reflect, but to deflect. It's about withholding presence and communication in a way that leaves the other person emotionally stranded. Stonewalling often arises during conflict, especially when emotions run high. It can be a learned behavior, especially for those who grew up in environments where expressing emotion was unsafe or discouraged. For some, it becomes a defense mechanism, a way to avoid discomfort, vulnerability, or perceived failure. But regardless of the reason, the impact is profound. It stalls conflict resolution, deepens misunderstandings, and sends a clear yet unspoken message: your words don't matter. Your feelings are too much. I am not emotionally available to you. In romantic relationships, stonewalling can be especially painful. It disrupts intimacy by turning moments of connection into cold detachment. After a disagreement, instead of talking things through, one partner may go silent, avoiding eye contact, closing off affection, or retreating behind a screen. The other partner, desperate for resolution, may chase, plead, or over-explain, only to be met with more silence. This imbalance can turn love into emotional labor, where one person constantly reaches out and the other constantly retreats. And in that dynamic, safety, trust, and communication begin to break down. Over time, chronic stonewalling conditions the other person to shrink. They stop bringing things up. They start editing their words to avoid conflict. They suppress needs, bury emotions, and accept silence as a response. Not because the relationship is healthy, but because they're afraid of being emotionally shut out again. Stonewalling doesn't just pause the conversation. It pauses growth, closeness, and emotional safety. And eventually, the silence doesn't feel like peace. It feels like punishment. In friendships and family relationships, stonewalling may look like someone disappearing after a disagreement, ignoring texts, or pretending everything is fine while emotionally disengaging. This kind of behavior teaches others that expressing discomfort leads to disconnection. Instead of fostering openness, it instills fear. Fear of being too much, too needy, or too emotional. It silences honest communication and replaces it with walking on eggshells. What's important to understand is that while stonewalling may feel like control to the one using it, it's experienced as rejection by the one receiving it. It sends a message that the relationship is conditional. That emotional availability is only granted when things are comfortable. It teaches others that their feelings are inconvenient, that their voice is unwelcome, and that resolution is not a shared goal. And in doing so, it creates emotional isolation within what's supposed to be a shared emotional space. Recognizing stonewalling is the first step to addressing it. If you find yourself feeling consistently shut out, if attempts to communicate are met with silence or deflection, you might be experiencing it. Likewise, if you notice yourself shutting down, avoiding hard conversations, or emotionally withdrawing when things get tense, you may be unintentionally stonewalling others. It's not always conscious. Sometimes it's the only way someone has learned to cope with conflict. But awareness opens the door to change. If you're on the receiving end, it's essential to protect your emotional well-being. You might say something like, "I want to work through this with you, but I need communication, not silence." You have a right to be heard. You have a right to clarity. If your attempts are continually ignored, it may be necessary to step back. Not as punishment, but as self-protection. You cannot force someone to be emotionally present. But you can choose to honor your own emotional needs. If you recognize stonewalling in yourself, know that it's not a character flaw. It's a coping mechanism. But healthy relationships require presence, even when it's hard. Learning to say, "I feel overwhelmed and need some time, but I'll come back to this," can change everything. It signals that while you're protecting your emotional limits, you're also committed to resolution. That's what connection requires. Not constant agreement, but mutual effort. Not silence, but the courage to return to the conversation. Stonewalling may feel like self-protection in the moment, but in the long run, it's a barrier to intimacy, growth, and healing. It tells others that their feelings aren't safe with you. It teaches them to suppress rather than express. But every wall built can also be taken down. With willingness, empathy, and effort, even the longest silences can give way to understanding. Because the goal isn't to win an argument. It's to preserve the bond. And that bond can only thrive in spaces where voices are heard, emotions are met, and silence isn't used as a weapon. Hoovering is a subtle but manipulative tactic used to re-enter someone's life after a period of distance, conflict, or even a breakup. It is named after the vacuum cleaner brand because it resembles the act of being emotionally sucked back in. Often used by narcissists or emotionally manipulative individuals, hoovering isn't driven by genuine remorse or a desire for healthy reconnection. Instead, it's about regaining control, rekindling dependency, or reasserting dominance. It can feel like love, regret, or a second chance. But it's typically the start of another cycle of manipulation. The hallmark of hoovering is that it often appears out of nowhere. You may have spent weeks or months in silence, trying to heal or create distance, and then suddenly receive a message out of the blue. It might be an apology, a memory from the past, or a question that seems innocuous. Just thinking about you, or how have you been? It can be friendly, romantic, or sentimental. But beneath that gentle re-entry often lies a calculated motive to draw you back into a dynamic that once disempowered you. Hoovering plays on emotional vulnerability. The manipulator may know your soft spots, the words that comfort you, the memories that pull at your heart, or the wounds that haven't fully healed. They use this knowledge strategically, crafting messages or actions that feel personal and well-timed. They might say they've changed, had an epiphany, or finally realized what you meant to them. They might reference shared moments or things only the two of you would understand. These gestures are designed to disarm your defenses and reopen the emotional door you tried so hard to close. What makes hoovering so difficult to resist is that it mimics sincerity. The words sound right. The timing feels magical. You want to believe that things can be different this time. After all, many people hope for reconciliation, growth, or closure. The person hoovering knows this and often exploits it. They don't necessarily want to rebuild something healthy. They want access. Access to your time, energy, emotions, or even resources. Once they have that access, the cycle often begins again: charm, control, conflict, and then withdrawal. Until the next round of hoovering starts anew. Hoovering doesn't always come through words. It can appear in indirect actions. The manipulator might suddenly like your social media posts, send you a song that reminds them of you, or bump into you accidentally in a place they know you frequent. These gestures might seem small or random, but they often serve as emotional fishing lines, testing the waters to see if you'll bite. And if you do, even slightly, they'll often escalate the engagement, moving from subtle to more direct attempts to re-establish contact. In more manipulative forms, hoovering can even involve guilt or crisis. A person may contact you to say they're depressed, struggling, or going through something difficult, and they just needed someone who understands. In these cases, your empathy is the target. They rely on your compassion to override your boundaries. You may feel like turning them away would make you a bad person, and that emotional leverage is what draws you back in. Suddenly, it's not about your healing anymore. It's about their needs, their feelings, their narrative. Hoovering can happen in romantic relationships, but also in friendships, family dynamics, or toxic workplace environments. A friend you distance yourself from may reach out with a nostalgic memory. A family member who once belittled you may send a heartfelt holiday message. A toxic boss may offer you a promotion after months of mistreatment. In every scenario, the underlying mechanism is the same. They're not reaching out to acknowledge your boundaries or respect your space. They're reaching out to regain influence. For those who have been hoovered before, the cycle can feel endless. Every time you step away, there's a pull to return. And with each return, it becomes harder to walk away again. You begin to question your judgment. You may wonder if you were too harsh, too emotional, or too impulsive. This self-doubt is exactly what the manipulator counts on. They want you to believe that the break was your mistake, and that reconnecting is the right thing to do. But what's right for your well-being doesn't often align with their intentions. Recognizing hoovering requires tuning into the pattern, not just the moment. Ask yourself, does this person respect my boundaries, or do they only show up when they want something? Do they engage in consistent, respectful behavior, or do they disappear after they get what they want? Do they take accountability for past actions, or do they gloss over them with charm and distractions? These questions help illuminate whether the outreach is rooted in growth or manipulation. Responding to hoovering depends on your circumstances, but clarity is key. If you've chosen to walk away from someone for your mental or emotional health, you owe no explanation for continuing to protect your peace. Ignoring attempts at contact is not cruelty. It's a boundary. If you choose to respond, do so from a grounded place. Be cautious with nostalgia. Be mindful of tone. Don't confuse sentiment for sincerity. If the conversation begins to feel manipulative, you can disengage at any time. You are not obligated to stay in a dialogue that reopens old wounds. Protecting yourself from hoovering starts with trusting your own growth. You left the situation for a reason. You saw a truth that was painful but necessary. You chose healing over familiarity. And those choices deserve to be honored. Manipulators thrive in doubt and emotional confusion, but they lose their grip when you stay anchored in self-awareness. You are not unkind for closing a door that someone repeatedly used to hurt you. You are not cold for protecting your energy from cycles that left you drained. In healthy relationships, reconciliation is possible. But it comes with responsibility, not just words. It comes with demonstrated change, sustained effort, and mutual respect. Hoovering offers none of that. It offers quick fixes, sweet words, and borrowed emotions. But it lacks depth. It lacks accountability. And it lacks the consistency required for genuine trust. Once you see that clearly, the magic starts to fade. What once looked like love begins to look like control. What once sounded like care begins to sound like bait. In the end, hoovering is not about healing. It's about hijacking your healing. It disrupts progress, delays closure, and reopens chapters that were never meant to be rewritten. But you don't have to answer the knock at the door just because it sounds familiar. You can choose silence. You can choose distance. You can choose the peace that comes not from rekindling an old fire, but from walking steadily into the light of your own freedom. Withholding is a quiet yet deeply painful form of emotional manipulation. It involves the deliberate refusal to give something that is needed for connection, communication, or mutual understanding. Whether that be affection, attention, affirmation, intimacy, or even basic acknowledgement. Unlike direct conflict or overt aggression, withholding operates through absence. It's not about what someone says or does. It's about what they intentionally don't. And over time, that silence, that emotional starvation, becomes louder than words ever could. At its core, withholding is about control. By refusing to give you something you need. Whether it's a kind word, a loving gesture, a response to a question, or a simple conversation. The person creates an imbalance of power. You begin to chase, to question, to shrink. You wonder what you did wrong, why things feel so tense, or why the emotional warmth that once felt natural now feels conditional. The manipulator holds back not because they can't connect, but because they want you to feel the sting of that disconnection. They want to remind you that they're the one with access to the emotional resources you need. Withholding can take many forms. It might be physical, refusing touch, sex, or closeness. It might be verbal, refusing to communicate, to respond, or to acknowledge something important. It can be emotional, refusing empathy, support, or validation. Sometimes, it's subtle, a partner who doesn't answer your texts for hours after a disagreement, or a friend who goes cold when you share something vulnerable. Other times, it's more blatant, a parent who ignores your accomplishments, a spouse who refuses affection unless certain conditions are met, or a colleague who withholds cooperation until they get their way. The impact of withholding is cumulative. At first, it may feel like a misunderstanding, a bad day, a miscommunication, or emotional fatigue. But when it becomes a pattern, it sends a powerful message: your needs are not important. Your voice is not welcome. Your connection is conditional. And the longer it goes on, the more it wears you down. You begin to internalize the silence, wondering if you're asking for too much or being too sensitive. You start managing their emotions instead of expressing your own. You may even come to believe that love is something you must earn by being quieter, softer, or less needy. What makes withholding so damaging is that it strikes at the most fundamental human needs: connection, affirmation, and belonging. We are social beings, wired for reciprocity and emotional resonance. When someone withholds those things from us, it disrupts our sense of emotional safety. It creates confusion, anxiety, and insecurity. You may find yourself constantly analyzing interactions, trying to decode cold tones, short answers, or changed behavior. The emotional distance becomes a puzzle you feel compelled to solve, even though you're not the one who created it. Withholding often hides behind plausible excuses. The person may claim to be tired, busy, stressed, or just not in the mood. And while these are all valid experiences in moderation, chronic withholding isn't about occasional withdrawal. It's about consistent emotional unavailability used as leverage. It's the silence after you express a need. It's the dismissive shrug after you open your heart. It's the emotional void that follows your vulnerability. And over time, it conditions you to stop reaching out altogether. In romantic relationships, withholding can look like a partner who never says "I love you" unless you say it first. Or not at all. It can be the quiet rejection of physical touch, or the absence of praise when you've done something thoughtful. It might be the refusal to talk after a disagreement, leaving issues unresolved and tension unspoken. The pain of these absences is compounded by the intimacy of the relationship. The person who is supposed to be your safe space becomes the source of silent harm, withholding the very things that once made you feel connected and valued. In families, withholding may appear as a lack of approval, affection, or attention. A parent may withhold praise as a form of control, believing that love must be earned through obedience or achievement. Siblings may withhold support or loyalty in times of emotional need. Over time, these patterns teach individuals that love is transactional, and that expressing emotional needs leads not to comfort, but to punishment or neglect. These early lessons shape how we show up in adult relationships, often recreating the dynamics we once learned to survive. In the workplace, withholding can manifest as a lack of communication, support, or collaboration. A manager may withhold information to maintain control, or a coworker may withhold help to create advantage. This not only undermines teamwork, but creates an atmosphere of fear, mistrust, and emotional scarcity. Employees feel unseen, unvalued, and unsafe. And like all forms of withholding, the emotional impact goes far beyond the surface. It signals that value is conditional, and that speaking up or showing vulnerability will be met with indifference or worse. Responding to withholding requires awareness, boundaries, and self-trust. The first step is recognizing that the silence is not your fault. You are not responsible for someone else's inability to communicate, connect, or show up emotionally. You deserve to be in relationships where your needs are heard, where affection is given freely, and where emotional safety is mutual. If you find yourself in a pattern where your needs are consistently met with silence or distance, it's time to reassess the dynamic. Not to blame yourself, but to protect yourself. Healthy communication is not always comfortable, but it is present. It engages. It responds. It doesn't retreat into silence every time the emotional waters get deep. If someone needs space, they communicate that respectfully. If someone disagrees, they engage thoughtfully. Withholding, on the other hand, punishes rather than protects. It uses distance to create power. And you do not have to participate in that game. You can set boundaries by saying, "I'm open to discussing this, but I won't continue to engage if communication is one-sided." You can step away from dynamics that leave you emotionally depleted, even if the silence makes you feel guilty. You can remind yourself that love is not proven by your ability to tolerate emotional neglect. It's reflected in the mutual willingness to show up, speak up, and grow together. In the end, withholding is not quiet. It's loud with meaning. It speaks of power imbalances, emotional fear, and unspoken resentments. But you are not helpless in the face of it. You can choose connection with those who communicate, respond, and care. You can honor your needs without apology. You can refuse to shrink into silence just to keep the peace. And in doing so, you reclaim the right to be fully seen, fully heard, and fully loved. Fear-mongering is the calculated use of fear to manipulate thoughts, behaviors, or decisions. It doesn't rely on facts, reason, or open dialogue. It relies on anxiety, panic, and worst-case scenarios. It's a tactic that thrives on exaggeration, selective storytelling, and emotional pressure. Instead of informing someone, fear-mongering seeks to influence them by flooding their mind with danger, risk, and loss. Whether it's used in politics, media, relationships, or everyday interactions, the goal is the same: to control through fear rather than through trust or understanding. At its core, fear-mongering taps into one of our most primal instincts: survival. Human beings are wired to respond quickly to threats, whether real or perceived. Fear narrows our focus, bypasses our rational mind, and prompts quick action. Manipulators know this, and they use it. They use fear to create urgency, to limit critical thinking, and to push people into making decisions they might not otherwise make. What if you lose everything? What if no one else will love you? What if the worst happens? These are questions. They're emotional weapons. In relationships, fear-mongering can be deeply personal. A controlling partner might say, "You'll never find someone better," or "You're nothing without me." These phrases aren't expressions of concern. They're attempts to make someone afraid of leaving, afraid of growing, or afraid of independence. The fear doesn't have to be based on truth. It just has to be believable enough to keep the other person small, silent, or stuck. Over time, the one on the receiving end may internalize this fear, believing the narrative that the world outside the relationship is more dangerous than the dysfunction inside it. In families, fear-mongering can be passed down like an emotional heirloom. Parents may use fear to enforce obedience, threatening emotional withdrawal or punishment if their children stray from certain beliefs or expectations. "If you don't listen to me, you'll ruin your life. If you make that choice, you'll end up alone." These words may come from a place of worry, but when fear is the primary tool of influence, love becomes conditional. Children raised in this environment often grow up with anxiety, indecision, and a deep-rooted fear of disappointing others. Fear-mongering is also rampant in politics and media. Leaders, pundits, and influencers use emotionally charged language to stir panic and division. They exaggerate threats, paint others as enemies, and present themselves as the only solution. The world is ending. The enemy is everywhere. If you don't act now, if you don't vote this way, believe this narrative, or follow this leader, you're in danger. The fear becomes a fog that clouds judgment and reduces complex issues to simplistic, emotional choices. In this space, truth becomes secondary to survival. What makes fear-mongering so effective is that it often contains a grain of truth. The manipulator may highlight real concerns, but they magnify them, distort them, or leave out important context. They turn possibility into inevitability. Instead of, "This could happen," it becomes, "This will happen." And once someone is afraid, they're more likely to comply. They stop questioning. They stop exploring other perspectives. They become emotionally dependent on the person who claims to protect them from the fear they themselves introduced. Fearmongering is rarely loud. Sometimes it's whispered. It can take the form of doubt, hesitation, or caution disguised as concern. "I'm just trying to protect you. I don't want you to get hurt. Are you sure you're ready for that?" These statements may sound supportive, but when repeated with subtle negativity or constant warning, they plant seeds of fear. They undermine confidence. They suggest that safety lies not in personal growth or risk-taking, but in obedience, caution, and sticking to the status quo. One of the most harmful effects of fearmongering is paralysis. The constant barrage of warnings, threats, or hypotheticals can make a person freeze. They stop moving forward. They stop making decisions. They start believing that every option leads to pain or danger. And so, they stay where they are. Not because they're content, but because fear has convinced them it's the safest place to be. This emotional paralysis can linger for years, leaving people stuck in jobs, relationships, or environments that no longer serve them, simply because they were made to fear what lies beyond. The antidote to fearmongering is awareness and self-trust. The moment you recognize fear as a tool rather than a truth, its power begins to fade. You can pause and ask yourself, is this fear rooted in fact, or in someone else's agenda? Am I being informed, or am I being pressured? What would I choose if fear wasn't in the room? These questions bring you back to clarity. They restore your ability to choose from a place of intention rather than impulse. In healthy relationships, whether personal, professional, or societal, fear is not used as a method of influence. Instead, trust, respect, and open communication create a foundation for understanding. If someone truly cares about your well-being, they will not try to control you through fear. They will empower you to think, to feel, and to choose for yourself. They will offer support, not threats. They will guide, not intimidate. And most of all, they will honor your ability to handle risk, to navigate life, and to grow, even when things are uncertain. If you find yourself constantly afraid, it's worth examining where that fear is coming from, and who benefits from it. Is the fear helping you, or is it limiting you? Is it making you safer, or smaller? Is it rooted in love, or in control? Fear is a natural part of life, but when it becomes the dominant voice in your mind, it may be a sign that someone else has been whispering in your ear for too long. Choosing courage in the face of fearmongering is not about being fearless. It's about being discerning. It's about taking fear by the hand, asking it where it came from, and deciding whether to believe it. It's about remembering that freedom often lies on the other side of fear, and that no one has the right to cage you in with imaginary threats. Your path, your choices, and your truth should never be dictated by someone else's agenda, no matter how urgent or convincing it may seem. In the end, fearmongering is not about keeping you safe. It's about keeping you small. But you are not meant to live under emotional ceilings built by other people's warnings. You are meant to rise, to move forward, to face uncertainty with a steady heart and a curious mind. And when fear shows up next time, loud or quiet, you'll know what it is. You'll see it, question it, and choose your own way anyway. Intimidation is the deliberate use of fear, pressure, or dominance to influence another person's behavior. It doesn't always come with raised voices or clenched fists. Often, it's more subtle. A look, a tone, a threat that lingers just under the surface of a sentence. It's the art of making someone feel small, hesitant, or off balance without ever needing to raise a hand. At its core, intimidation is not about strength. It's about control. The person using it doesn't seek connection, understanding, or mutual respect. They seek power. And they'll use whatever emotional, psychological, or even physical means necessary to maintain it. In relationships, intimidation often hides in plain sight. It can be cloaked in sarcasm, silence, or strategic outbursts. A partner might slam doors, drive recklessly during an argument, or use body language to convey unspoken threat. They may hover during conversations, invade personal space, or speak in a tone that makes your stomach drop, even if their words sound calm. You may not be able to point to one specific act of aggression, but the overall effect is clear. You feel afraid to speak, afraid to disagree, afraid to be fully yourself. That's how intimidation works. It doesn't silence you directly. It makes you silence yourself. Intimidation is often built on unpredictability. You never quite know what will trigger a reaction. One day, a disagreement is met with calm discussion. The next, it's met with icy silence or an explosive rant. This inconsistency keeps you on edge. You become hyper-aware of your words, your tone, your timing. You start walking on emotional eggshells, trying to anticipate their reactions before they happen. But no matter how careful you are, it never feels safe. Because intimidation isn't about communication. It's about keeping you in a state of quiet submission. In workplaces, intimidation can take the form of public shaming, veiled threats about job security, or an atmosphere of constant surveillance. A manager might criticize you in front of others, assign unrealistic deadlines, or use performance reviews as a tool for fear rather than growth. They might hover near your desk, micromanage every task, or make offhand comments about how replaceable people are. These tactics don't just affect performance. They affect morale, self-worth, and emotional well-being. Employees start to dread going to work, not because they hate the job, but because they fear the person in charge. What makes intimidation so effective and so damaging is that it creates internal confusion. The person being intimidated may struggle to articulate what's happening. They may say, "It's not like they hit me," or "I guess I'm just overreacting." That's the trap. Because intimidation often lacks visible bruises or dramatic evidence, it's easy for others, and for yourself, to dismiss the pain. But fear doesn't need proof to be real. When your nervous system is constantly on high alert, when your voice catches in your throat every time you speak your mind, that's not overreaction. That's survival. In families, intimidation can become generational. A parent may use threats, harsh discipline, or emotional withdrawal to keep their children in line. "Because I said so" becomes a mantra, and questioning authority is met with punishment. Children raised in such environments often learn to comply rather than communicate, to appease rather than express. And as adults, they may carry that fear into their own relationships, either replicating the cycle or falling into dynamics where intimidation feels familiar. The legacy of fear is rarely loud, but it lingers, shaping how we show up in the world long after the threat has passed. Sometimes, intimidation is disguised as protection. "I'm just doing this for your own good. I only act this way because I care." These phrases may sound like concern, but when they're paired with fear-based control, they lose their sincerity. Real care doesn't require fear. Real love doesn't use intimidation to enforce obedience. When someone uses affection as a mask for dominance, they're not protecting you. they're manipulating you. And when fear is dressed in the clothing of love, it becomes even harder to walk away. Because now you're not just leaving fear. You're leaving something that once felt safe. Intimidation can also be emotional rather than physical. It can take the form of intellectual superiority, where someone uses their knowledge to belittle or confuse you. It can show up as judgmental stares, constant correction, or criticism masked as helpful advice. It can be financial, controlling access to money, threatening to cut you off, or using financial dependence as leverage. Whatever the form, the impact is the same. You feel powerless, uncertain, and trapped. One of the most painful outcomes of intimidation is self-erasure. Over time, you stop speaking your truth. You stop making eye contact. You stop dreaming, creating, or expressing. You shrink your world to avoid confrontation. And slowly, you begin to lose sight of who you are outside of fear. Intimidation doesn't just silence your voice. It rewrites your identity. It convinces you that being small is safer than being free. But that's the lie that keeps the cycle alive. Recognizing intimidation is the first step to reclaiming your power. It begins with trusting your instincts. If you consistently feel anxious, fearful, or diminished around someone, those feelings matter. You don't need bruises to justify your pain. Emotional wounds are real, even when they're invisible. Pay attention to the tension in your body, the hesitation in your speech, the way your spirit dims in someone's presence. These are signs, and they are valid. Setting boundaries is crucial. You don't have to justify your discomfort. You don't have to wait for permission to protect yourself. You can say, "I'm not okay with that tone," or "this conversation doesn't feel safe for me right now." You can limit contact, create distance, or walk away entirely. Intimidation thrives in silence, but boundaries break that silence with clarity. They don't always change the other person, but they protect your peace. And that peace is worth everything. If you've used intimidation in the past, consciously or unconsciously, it's never too late to change. Reflect on the impact of your actions, not just your intentions. Apologize without defensiveness. Learn new ways to communicate that don't rely on power plays. Because real connection doesn't require fear. It requires vulnerability, honesty, and respect. In the end, intimidation is about power without permission. It is fear used as a leash. But no one has the right to control your voice, your choices, or your truth. You are not weak for being afraid. You are human. But your fear doesn't have to define you. You can name it. You can face it. And slowly, you can step beyond it. Because freedom begins the moment you remember that your voice was never meant to be silenced. Rewriting history is a psychological tactic used to distort the truth of past events to fit a new narrative. One that benefits the person doing the rewriting. It doesn't involve facts or fairness. It involves manipulation. It's not a discussion about what happened. It's a reshaping of memory, a rearrangement of timelines, an emotional edit of reality. And when it's used repeatedly, it can leave the other person doubting their own experiences, questioning their own memory, and slowly losing their grasp on what really happened. It's not just about denial. It's about control. This tactic often appears in emotionally abusive relationships, where one person seeks to avoid responsibility for past behaviors by simply pretending things happened differently. It might be subtle at first. A few comments here and there that sound like misremembering. "I never said that," or "that's not how it happened," even when you know it is. Over time, the narrative shifts. You begin to hear entirely different versions of events. Versions where your feelings were exaggerated, your reactions unjustified, and their actions were either innocent or heroic. Suddenly, the conversation that left you in tears becomes, in their retelling, a misunderstanding. The betrayal you felt is now your overreaction. The lie they told becomes a joke you misunderstood. What makes rewriting history so powerful is that it doesn't rely on shouting or force. It relies on doubt. Most people want to believe they're being fair. They want to keep the peace, avoid drama, or simply make sense of complicated situations. The person rewriting history knows this. They use calm tones, confident body language, and selective memory to see confusion. They don't need you to agree with them right away. They just need you to question yourself. Once they achieve that, they've shifted the balance. Now you're not standing firmly in your truth. You're trying to reconcile your memory with their version. And the more you do that, the more ground you lose. In relationships, this can lead to emotional erasure. If someone continually rewrites your shared history, they slowly erase your voice from the narrative. Your perspective disappears. Your hurt becomes a footnote. Your entire emotional reality is invalidated in favor of a story that paints them in a better light. It's a slow dismantling of your identity within the relationship. One day, you may find yourself apologizing for things you didn't do, or defending boundaries you didn't actually break. You might feel exhausted, not from the conflict itself, but from the constant mental work of remembering what really happened. This tactic is closely related to gaslighting, but with a historical twist. While gaslighting tends to happen in real time, distorting events as they unfold, rewriting history focuses on the past. It's about taking what's already happened and reshaping it so the manipulator emerges as the victim, the hero, or the misunderstood party. They may even claim you're the one rewriting things. You're always changing the story, they'll say, as they rewrite it themselves. It's a form of projection, a way of flipping the script so they never have to face accountability. In families, rewriting history often becomes generational. Parents may deny past abuse, neglect, or emotional absence by recasting themselves as victims of ungrateful children. "We did our best" becomes a shield that erases the damage. "You had a good childhood" becomes a dismissal of pain. These rewritten stories are often repeated so often that they become family myths. Versions of the past that feel easier to live with but are built on denial, not truth. And those who try to challenge the narrative are often labeled as troublemakers, overly emotional, or disloyal. In friendships, rewriting history might appear as a friend who betrayed you but later claims it was just a misunderstanding. They minimize what happened, omit key details, or tell mutual friends a version of events that protects their image. By the time the story spreads, you're no longer the hurt party. You're the one who overreacted. This kind of distortion doesn't just damage the relationship. It damages your reputation, your sense of belonging, and your trust in your own perspective. It isolates you from support and leaves you feeling like you're fighting a battle no one else can see. In the workplace, this behavior can be used to shift blame, rewrite project outcomes, or protect authority. A manager might take credit for your ideas or claim they supported you when they actually withheld resources. A coworker might deny ever missing a deadline or insist that you agreed to something you never did. These small manipulations accumulate, eroding your credibility while elevating theirs. And because the rewritten version often favors those in power, it's difficult to challenge without looking defensive or emotional. In this way, rewriting history becomes a tool not only of manipulation, but of professional control. So how do you protect yourself from someone who rewrites the past? The first step is to document reality, mentally or otherwise. Keep track of conversations, decisions, agreements, and important events. Write them down if you need to. When someone tries to distort your memory, you'll have a clear record to ground yourself. But more importantly, trust your feelings. If something hurt you, it was real. If you remember something clearly, you don't have to accept a version that erases your truth just to keep the peace. Setting boundaries is essential. You can say, "That's not how I remember it," or "It's okay if we experienced it differently, but I'm standing by my memory." You don't have to argue or convince. Your goal is not to win the story. It's to stay connected to your truth. If someone repeatedly invalidates your perspective, it may be necessary to distance yourself. Not to punish them, but to protect your sense of reality. Because emotional safety includes being allowed to remember your life as it actually happened. If you find yourself rewriting your own history to make others more comfortable, it's important to pause and ask why. Are you minimizing your pain? Are you reshaping events to avoid conflict or guilt? Reclaiming your truth is not about blame. It's about healing. You don't have to exaggerate the past to validate it. You just have to tell it honestly. Even if no one else agrees. Even if it makes others uncomfortable. Because your story matters. And it deserves to be told without distortion. In the end, rewriting history is not about truth. It's about image. It's about protecting egos, avoiding shame, and maintaining control. But truth doesn't vanish just because it's inconvenient. It waits patiently beneath the surface, ready to be remembered. And when you stand in that truth, even quietly, you begin to undo the manipulation. You remind yourself that your memory is valid. That your voice matters. That your past cannot be stolen by someone else's version of it. You reclaim your narrative. And in doing so, you reclaim your power. Deniability is the quiet art of manipulation without fingerprints. It's the ability to do harm, self-confusion, or create emotional distress while maintaining just enough distance to claim innocence. It's not about overt abuse. It's about subtle control. It's the kind of behavior that leaves you feeling hurt, but unsure if you're allowed to be. The person using deniability is careful with their words, calculated with their actions, and always ready with an explanation that makes them look innocent and you look unreasonable. They don't need to prove you wrong. They just need to make sure you can't prove them wrong. At its core, deniability functions through ambiguity. The person says just enough to imply something without saying it outright. They give you a look, drop a comment, or create a situation where you feel dismissed or manipulated. But if you bring it up, they deny it. "That's not what I meant. You're reading too much into it. I was just joking." These phrases are designed to make you question your own perception. And that's where deniability gains power. Not from control over facts, but from control over interpretation. This tactic shows up often in emotionally manipulative relationships. A partner might consistently flirt with others in front of you, but if you express discomfort, you're told you're jealous or insecure. If you notice passive-aggressive behavior, you're told you're imagining things. They maintain just enough charm or vagueness to avoid accountability. And every time you try to address the issue, the conversation circles back to your reaction, not their action. You're left questioning your intuition, doubting your instincts, and feeling like the problem is you. But deep down, you know something's off. You just can't prove it. Deniability is a cousin of gaslighting, but with an important difference. Gaslighting aims to erode your sense of reality over time, often by actively denying obvious facts. Deniability, on the other hand, plays in the gray areas. It leaves no clear proof, no direct lies. Just omissions, subtle digs, and half-truths. It thrives in plausible explanations and reasonable doubt. And because it never fully declares its intent, it allows the manipulator to operate without ever having to take full responsibility. If called out, they simply shift the blame back to your perception. In family dynamics, deniability can become a lifelong pattern. A parent might favor one child over another in subtle but consistent ways. Extra praise, more attention, or kinder words. But if the neglected child points it out, the parent denies it. "I treat you all the same," they say, even though actions show otherwise. Or a sibling may stir conflict behind the scenes and then pretend to be the peacemaker, denying any role in the dysfunction. These patterns often lead to internalized guilt and confusion. You feel the imbalance, but no one else sees it. Or they see it and refuse to acknowledge it. In the workplace, deniability can become a method of leadership for toxic managers. A boss might make vague suggestions that lead to unethical behavior, but never give direct orders. If things go wrong, they claim, "That's not what I asked for." Or they may deliver backhanded compliments or criticisms masked as jokes, leaving employees unsure of whether they've just been praised or belittled. The ambiguity ensures that the manager keeps authority without being held accountable. And the employee is left feeling unsteady, always unsure of where they stand. The psychological impact of dealing with deniability is subtle but severe. It leads to self-doubt, emotional exhaustion, and the gradual erosion of self-trust. When you're constantly questioning whether your feelings are valid, your sense of self begins to weaken. You might become hypervigilant, reading into every word or gesture. Or you might become emotionally numb, convincing yourself that nothing is worth reacting to. Either way, the goal of the person using deniability has been achieved. They maintain control, avoid blame, and keep you tangled in uncertainty. One of the most frustrating aspects of deniability is how well it hides. From the outside, the person using it often appears calm, reasonable, even generous. They may come across as thoughtful in public, while privately creating confusion and emotional instability. This contrast makes it harder for others to believe your experience. "They don't seem like the type," people might say. "They've always been nice to me." And that's part of the strategy. The more reasonable they appear, the more isolated you feel when you try to explain the harm you've experienced. To protect yourself from deniability, you must begin by trusting your perception. Your feelings are valid, even when someone else denies them. If something consistently makes you feel uncomfortable, dismissed, or devalued, you don't need concrete evidence to honor that experience. Emotional harm doesn't always come with a paper trail. Sometimes it arrives in the form of subtle manipulation, plausible denial, and consistent patterns that never quite cross the line, but always leave you questioning your worth. Setting boundaries is crucial. You can say, "That didn't feel good to me," or "I know what I heard." Even if the other person denies or deflects, your boundary is not for their agreement. It's for your clarity. You're allowed to step away from conversations that make you feel manipulated. You're allowed to distance yourself from people who consistently avoid accountability. And you're allowed to reclaim your voice, even if someone tries to talk over it with ambiguity. If you've ever used deniability yourself, knowingly or not, it's not too late to change. Begin by taking responsibility for your words and actions, even when it's uncomfortable. Speak clearly. Mean what you say. Avoid backhanded comments or emotional games. Relationships built on trust require honesty, not cleverness. They thrive in transparency, not in the shadows of interpretation. In the end, deniability is about control without consequence. It's the silent manipulation of reality. But truth doesn't need to be loud to be strong. You don't have to fight or prove. Just see clearly. Recognize patterns. Honor your gut. Stand in your truth. Because no matter how skillfully someone twists the story, your experience still matters. Your clarity still counts. And your right to peace is never up for debate. False equivalence is a logical fallacy that compares two things as if they are equal when, in reality, they are not. It's a way of creating the illusion of fairness or balance while subtly distorting the truth. On the surface, it can sound reasonable. It uses phrases like, both sides are to blame, or well, you did something similar, or everyone makes mistakes. But underneath, it's not about logic. It's about minimizing harm, diluting accountability, or deflecting attention from an uncomfortable truth. False equivalence is not a neutral perspective. It's a manipulative tactic that turns clarity into confusion. The essence of false equivalence is imbalance disguised as balance. It compares things that may be superficially similar but are fundamentally different in scale, context, or impact. For example, equating a lie told to avoid hurting someone's feelings with a deliberate act of deception designed to harm is not a fair comparison. Yes, both are technically lies, but their intentions and consequences are vastly different. When people use false equivalence, they erase those distinctions. They flatten nuance in order to serve an agenda. Whether that's to win an argument, avoid responsibility, or justify a bad decision. In relationships, false equivalence can show up in emotionally charged moments. Imagine one partner consistently dismisses the other's concerns, uses hurtful language, or stonewalls during conflict. When confronted, they might say, well, you raise your voice sometimes too, as if the occasional frustration is equal to chronic emotional neglect. This is false equivalence at work. It's a way to avoid addressing harmful behavior by finding a smaller, unrelated flaw in the other person and pretending the two are the same. The goal isn't resolution. It's deflection. It's not about owning one's actions. It's about balancing the emotional scales without addressing the truth. In families, false equivalence is often used to silence difficult conversations. A child may bring up past emotional neglect or harmful parenting patterns, only to hear, well, no one's perfect, or you weren't exactly an easy kid. These responses pretend to acknowledge both sides, but in reality, they minimize the child's pain by lumping it into a generic narrative of mutual imperfection. It's a way of avoiding discomfort, of escaping the vulnerability required to face how one's actions affected someone else. And it leaves the person seeking understanding feeling unheard and invalidated. In friendships, false equivalence can be used to dismiss boundaries. If you say, I felt hurt when you ignored my message, and your friend replies, well, you didn't text me first last week, they're not addressing the impact of their behavior. They're drawing a false line of comparison to shift the focus. The message becomes, your feelings are only valid if they outweigh mine. And in doing so, any chance for honest communication gets buried beneath a false idea of equality. False equivalence is especially common in arguments where accountability is uncomfortable. It's easier to say, we both made mistakes, than to say, I hurt you, and I need to take responsibility. It's easier to frame things as mutual than to admit that one person caused harm while the other tried to navigate it. And while mutual responsibility is important in healthy relationships, false equivalence undermines that by pretending all mistakes are equal, when they're not. This tactic also shows up in larger cultural or societal discussions. For example, someone might compare systemic injustice with individual discomfort, claiming everyone struggles, or both sides have extremists, as if personal experiences of hardship are equal to widespread oppression. This false equivalence derails meaningful conversations. It centers the focus not on solutions, but on emotional neutrality. And that neutrality, while it may feel safe, often serves the status quo. It protects those in power and invalidates those seeking change. In workplaces, false equivalence can be used to excuse bad leadership. If an employee raises a concern about toxic management, a superior might reply, "Well, employees aren't perfect either." This suggests that leadership failures are no more serious than minor employee shortcomings, even when the power dynamics and consequences are not remotely comparable. Again, it's not about solving the issue. It's about deflecting it. And over time, this creates a culture where truth is buried under layers of false balance, and accountability becomes almost impossible to reach. What makes false equivalence especially manipulative is that it often appeals to fairness. People want to be seen as balanced, non-judgmental, and open-minded. So when someone uses this tactic, it can feel like the mature or reasonable position. But fairness without truth isn't fairness. It's avoidance. Compassion without clarity isn't compassion. It's denial. And equality without context becomes just another tool to silence valid perspectives under the guise of even-handedness. To recognize false equivalence, you must look closely at what's being compared. Ask yourself, are the two things actually equal in impact, intention, and consequence? Is one being used to distract from the seriousness of the other? Is the comparison being made to move toward understanding, or to escape responsibility? These questions reveal whether the comparison is genuine, or just a rhetorical smokescreen. When someone uses false equivalence against you, it can be incredibly invalidating. You may feel like your experiences are being minimized, your pain being erased, or your perspective being reduced to a simple both sides narrative. In these moments, it's important to stay affirming your truth. You can say, "This isn't the same," or "That doesn't take away from what I'm saying." You don't have to accept a distorted mirror of your experience just because it's been wrapped in the language of fairness. Setting boundaries can also help. If someone consistently responds to your vulnerability with comparisons, redirection, or minimization, it's okay to step back. You're not obligated to debate someone who refuses to engage in honest reflection. You're allowed to protect your emotional space from conversations that twist your words or reshape your truth into something more comfortable for them. Clarity is not cruelty. Naming the difference between two things is not a personal attack. It's a step toward integrity. False equivalence may sound like wisdom, but it often lacks the courage to look at things as they really are. It avoids the discomfort of imbalance by pretending it doesn't exist. But growth, healing, and real connection only happen when we're willing to see clearly. When we acknowledge that not all harms are equal. That not all voices carry the same weight in every moment. That sometimes, the most honest thing we can do is say, "This is not the same." And it matters. Shaming is the act of making someone feel fundamentally wrong, unworthy, or inadequate because of something they did, said, felt, or even simply because of who they are. It's not the same as offering feedback, expressing disappointment, or holding someone accountable. Those actions invite reflection and change. Shaming, on the other hand, attacks identity. It doesn't say, "You made a mistake." It says, "You are a mistake." And that subtle shift makes all the difference. Over time, shaming doesn't lead to growth. It leads to shrinking. At its core, shaming is about control. It uses embarrassment, humiliation, or guilt as tools to change someone's behavior. It says, "If I make you feel small enough, maybe you'll fall in line." Whether it's through cutting words, disapproving looks, or public ridicule, the message is clear: you are not enough as you are. And the more this message is repeated, explicitly or implicitly. The deeper it burrows into the psyche, creating a landscape of self-doubt, perfectionism, and emotional silence. In personal relationships, shaming often hides behind concern. A partner might say, "I'm just being honest," after making a comment about your appearance or weight that leaves you feeling exposed. A parent might say, "You should know better," in a tone that doesn't teach but condemns. A friend might joke about something deeply personal, brushing it off as humor while watching you squirm. These moments may seem minor, even forgettable. But the sting lingers. And when repeated, they chip away at your confidence, replacing it with a quiet fear of being judged or rejected. Shaming is particularly destructive because it often targets vulnerability. It goes after the parts of us that are already tender. Our bodies, our emotions, our pasts, our dreams. Instead of creating a safe space for expression, it punishes openness. It makes us feel exposed for being human. And once that connection is made between vulnerability and punishment, we start to hide. We stop sharing. We stop taking risks. We start armoring up against the very intimacy we once craved. In families, shaming can become a generational pattern. A child who is shamed for crying may grow into an adult who cannot express sadness without feeling weak. A teen who is mocked for their identity may spend years trying to hide or fix what was never broken. The parent may claim they were just trying to toughen them up, but what they actually taught was shame, not resilience. Real strength comes from being able to feel, to express, to stumble and still be loved. Shaming doesn't build that. It builds fear-based compliance and internalized self-criticism. In schools and workplaces, shaming often masquerades as discipline or motivation. A teacher who mocks a student in front of the class. A boss who calls someone out in a meeting. A peer who spreads rumors or passes judgment behind closed doors. These actions aren't about accountability. They're about dominance. They create environments where people are more afraid of failure than inspired to grow. Where silence is safer than participation. Where self-worth is tied not to character, but to performance and approval. Shaming can also be internal. Sometimes, after years of receiving messages that who we are isn't good enough, we start echoing those messages to ourselves. The voice becomes ours. "You're so stupid. Why can't you get it right? No one's ever going to love you like this." This internalized shame can be even more damaging because it becomes constant, intimate, and invisible. It doesn't need a trigger. It lives in the background, quietly guiding our decisions, shaping our relationships, and limiting our lives. One of the most painful aspects of shaming is how isolating it is. It cuts us off. Not just from others, but from ourselves. When we feel ashamed, we want to disappear. We want to hide, to run, to escape the gaze of anyone who might see the parts of us we've been taught to hate. And yet, what we often need most in those moments is connection. Someone to say, "You are not alone in this. You are still worthy. You are still lovable." Shame pushes us into hiding. Healing pulls us back into the light. Shaming is not the same as guilt. Guilt says, "I did something wrong," and it can be a healthy compass when it leads to reflection and change. Shame, on the other hand, says, "I am something wrong." It doesn't just critique an action. It attacks identity. And that's why it sticks. Because it doesn't just ask us to change. It convinces us we're unworthy of love until we do. That's not growth. That's emotional imprisonment. Healing from shame begins with awareness. It starts with naming the messages you've absorbed. About your body, your emotions, your intelligence, your worth. It involves tracing those messages back to their source and asking, was that true? Was that love? Or was that someone else's pain dressed as authority? Often, the voices that shamed us were echoing their own wounds. That doesn't excuse it, but it helps us see the shame as something we inherited, not something we deserved. Setting boundaries is an act of self-protection. If someone in your life constantly uses shame as a weapon, mocking, judging, or demeaning, you have the right to create distance. You have the right to say, I will not participate in conversations that make me feel small. You do not owe anyone access to your heart if they only ever use it as a target. Protecting your peace is not weakness. It's wisdom. Learning to speak to yourself with kindness is a radical act in a world that profits from your self-doubt. Replace the inner critic with a gentler voice. Say, I made a mistake, but I'm still learning. Say, I feel insecure, but that doesn't make me unworthy. Say, I am allowed to take up space, to rest, to feel, to be. These aren't just affirmations. They are antidotes to shame. They are lifelines back to your own heart. In the end, shaming does not bring people closer. It pushes them away. From others, and from themselves. It does not create character. It creates fear. But love, the kind that accepts, that understands, that holds space, has the power to undo shame, to rewrite the story, to remind you that you are not broken and never were. You are a human being doing your best. And that is enough. Distraction is one of the quietest manipulation tactics. So subtle that most people don't even realize it's happening until long after the moment has passed. It doesn't rely on force or loudness. It doesn't require confrontation. Instead, it works by redirecting your attention away from the truth. It's the art of emotional misdirection, where the real issue is quietly removed from view while something more palatable, dramatic, or irrelevant takes center stage. The manipulator isn't trying to resolve the problem. They're simply trying to make sure you stop looking at it. At its core, distraction is about avoidance. When someone uses it deliberately, they are trying to sidestep accountability, vulnerability, or difficult conversations. Rather than engage in honest reflection or respond to a valid concern, they change the subject. Sometimes gently, sometimes with flair. They may bring up an unrelated topic, create a sudden crisis, crack a joke, or shift blame entirely. What matters isn't what they say. It's that it pulls your attention away from what truly matters. And once you're emotionally off course, the moment for real connection or accountability has passed. This tactic often plays out in personal relationships, especially during conflict. Imagine trying to have a conversation about feeling neglected, only to have your partner respond with a complaint about something you did weeks ago. The discussion is no longer about your feelings. It's now about defending yourself. Or you may bring up a boundary violation, and they respond with, well, remember when I helped you with that thing? Suddenly, the focus shifts from hurt to gratitude. It seems harmless, even sweet. But the original issue gets buried under layers of unrelated emotion. That's the power of distraction. It doesn't fight the truth directly. It just buries it. In more emotionally manipulative dynamics, distraction becomes a reliable tool for control. The manipulator learns what topics make you reactive, what stories draw you in, what problems you feel compelled to fix. When things get too real, when the truth gets too close, they throw a spark, and you go chasing the flame. They might create emotional drama, feign confusion, or present themselves as a victim in need of rescue. They're not engaging with the issue. They're performing around it. And each time you take the bait, the cycle is reinforced. In families, distraction is often passed down through patterns of emotional avoidance. Some families don't discuss real problems. They joke, deflect, or focus on appearances instead. A child may try to bring up a serious concern and be met with a sudden change of subject or an unrelated lecture. Over time, the child learns that truth makes people uncomfortable. That it's better to stay quiet, smile, and move on. Distraction becomes the emotional norm. A way to survive in an environment where honesty isn't welcomed. In workplaces, distraction can be used to dodge accountability or maintain power. A manager might avoid addressing a serious complaint by holding a surprise team-building event. An employee may sidestep criticism by flooding the conversation with excuses or switching to a different topic altogether. These tactics create a false sense of resolution. Everyone feels like something has happened, but nothing meaningful has changed. The problem remains, just buried under productivity, positivity, or professional jargon. The impact of repeated distraction is a kind of emotional dizziness. You start to feel like every conversation goes in circles. You might enter a discussion with clarity, only to leave feeling confused or unsure of what was even said. You may begin to doubt your ability to communicate or question whether your concerns are valid. And if this happens enough times, you may simply stop bringing things up at all. That's the goal of the manipulative use of distraction. Not to solve problems, but to exhaust your desire to even try. What makes distraction particularly insidious is that it often masquerades as kindness. Someone may shift focus with a smile, a laugh, or an offer to help with something else. It doesn't feel hostile. It feels soothing. But soothing is not the same as solving. And distraction is not the same as resolution. Just because someone lightens the mood doesn't mean they've lightened the emotional weight. In fact, sometimes the mood is lifted at the cost of truth. And over time, that kind of emotional bypassing creates deeper wounds than direct conflict ever could. Another layer of distraction is self-distraction. Sometimes we learn to distract ourselves from our own pain, fears, or truths. We bury ourselves in work, entertainment, busyness, or even helping others to avoid facing what's happening within us. This form of internal distraction can feel productive or noble, but it often serves the same purpose: avoidance. We don't want to sit with discomfort, so we reach for something else. Anything else. To fill the silence. But healing doesn't happen in distraction. It happens in presence. In the quiet, honest space we've been trained to avoid. Recognizing distraction as a tactic starts with watching where conversations go when something difficult is brought up. Does the person consistently pivot? Do they always have a story, a crisis, a counterpoint that derails the original topic? Do you find yourself constantly addressing side issues while the main one remains untouched? These are signs that distraction is being used not to connect, but to control. Responding to distraction requires gentle but firm redirection. You can say, "That's something we can talk about later, but right now I'm focusing on this," or "I hear you, but let's come back to what I was saying." You don't have to match their deflection with defensiveness. You just need to stay anchored in your truth. If the other person continues to avoid, you may need to reevaluate the dynamic. Healthy communication is about mutual attention, not emotional misdirection. Setting boundaries also means being willing to pause or walk away when distraction becomes a pattern. You are not obligated to chase every detour someone puts in front of you. You are allowed to say, "This conversation isn't productive right now," and return to it later. Or not at all. Your energy is valuable. And part of protecting it is learning the difference between someone who wants to resolve a problem and someone who just wants you to forget it ever existed. In the end, distraction is not always malicious. Sometimes it's just fear in disguise. Fear of conflict, fear of vulnerability, fear of change. But when distraction becomes a repeated pattern, it keeps relationships shallow and truths hidden. And you deserve more than that. You deserve clarity, connection, and the kind of dialogue that doesn't run from discomfort, but walks through it with care. Deflection is the subtle art of emotional redirection. It's a tactic used to avoid uncomfortable truths, dodge accountability, or sidestep vulnerability by shifting the focus elsewhere. On the surface, it may appear harmless. Someone changes the subject, cracks a joke, brings up your flaws instead of addressing their own. But over time, deflection erodes clarity, halts resolution, and makes honest communication nearly impossible. It's not a tool for understanding. It's a defense mechanism that keeps the real issue out of sight, and therefore, out of reach. At its core, deflection is about discomfort. The person using it often struggles with facing their own behavior, admitting fault, or sitting in emotional tension. Rather than engaging with the topic at hand, they push it away. Sometimes gently, sometimes forcefully. A simple question becomes a debate. A concern becomes an accusation. An attempt at connection becomes a moment of confusion. And just like that, the moment is lost. The truth remains unspoken, and the person trying to express it is left feeling unheard and frustrated. In personal relationships, deflection shows up in many forms. You might bring up something that hurt you, only to hear, "Well, you're not perfect either." Instead of addressing your pain, the spotlight is turned onto your flaws. Or you might try to talk about an ongoing issue, and they respond with a story about how hard their day was. It's not that their day doesn't matter, but the timing turns the conversation away from your needs and back onto theirs. This creates an imbalance. Your concerns are consistently delayed, redirected, or minimized. One of the most common deflection tactics is humor. When tension builds, the person might crack a joke or use sarcasm to lighten the mood. While laughter can sometimes help ease difficult moments, in the context of deflection, it serves as a distraction. The joke isn't there to comfort. It's there to avoid. And if you try to push further, you may be met with accusations of being too serious or too sensitive. These labels become barriers, keeping you from returning to the conversation that actually matters. In emotionally manipulative dynamics, deflection is often used to maintain control. The manipulator learns that if they can keep the focus off themselves, they never have to change. When confronted, they pivot. When asked for accountability, they offer excuses or counterattacks. If you point out a boundary violation, they suddenly remember something you did wrong 2 months ago. Now the conversation is no longer about the boundary. It's about your defensiveness. The subject has shifted, and so has the emotional energy. You go from standing in your truth to scrambling to explain yourself. Deflection can also take the form of intellectualization. Instead of engaging emotionally, the person responds with cold logic or abstract reasoning. You express hurt, and they respond with analysis. You say, "I felt abandoned," and they reply, "That wasn't my intention," followed by a list of reasons why they were technically not in the wrong. This response may sound rational, but it avoids the emotional core of the moment. It's easier to argue facts than to sit with feelings. Easier to sound right than to be real. In family systems, deflection often becomes an ingrained habit. Children who grew up in environments where emotional expression was discouraged may learn to deflect as a survival strategy. A parent might say, "Don't be dramatic," or you're always so emotional anytime a real feeling is expressed. Over time, those messages teach that truth is dangerous and silence is safe. As adults, these individuals may struggle to stay present during difficult conversations. They might shift topics unconsciously or feel panic when the spotlight turns inward. Deflection, in this context, isn't just manipulation. It's emotional protection. In the workplace, deflection can undermine trust and collaboration. A manager may deflect criticism by blaming subordinates. A colleague might respond to feedback with defensiveness or counter-accusations. Instead of addressing the issue, energy is wasted on interpersonal battles and hurt feelings. The team stops growing. The culture becomes defensive. People stop speaking up because they know they'll just be redirected, not heard. Deflection doesn't just block feedback. It blocks progress. The person on the receiving end of deflection often feels like they're chasing their own tail. You enter a conversation seeking clarity and leave feeling confused or ashamed. You wonder if you pushed too hard, said it wrong, or expected too much. That's the power of deflection. It doesn't just move the conversation. It moves your sense of certainty. You begin to question whether the issue was ever real in the first place. And when that doubt sets in, silence often follows. But clarity can begin with awareness. Recognizing deflection as a pattern allows you to stay grounded in your original intention. You can say, "We can talk about that later, but right now I'd like to stay with this issue," or, "I hear what you're saying, but I'm still feeling unresolved about what I brought up." You don't have to chase the redirection. You don't have to follow the distraction. You can name it, gently bring the focus back, and stay rooted in your truth. Setting boundaries around deflection is also key. If someone consistently avoids accountability, it's okay to step away from unproductive conversations. You are not responsible for dragging someone into self-awareness. You are only responsible for protecting your peace. If their pattern is to shift blame, avoid vulnerability, or talk in circles, you can choose to disengage. Not to punish them, but to preserve your emotional clarity. You deserve to be in dialogue with people who meet you with honesty, not avoidance. If you find yourself using deflection, consciously or not, it's worth exploring why. Are you afraid of being wrong? Are you uncomfortable with emotions? Have you learned that conflict is dangerous or unsafe? These insights don't make you bad. They make you human. But the more honest you are with yourself, the less you'll need to hide. Practice pausing when you feel the urge to shift the topic. Try saying, "That's hard for me to hear, but I'm willing to sit with it." Growth doesn't come from avoiding hard moments. It comes from staying present with them. In the end, deflection is not about truth. It's about escape. It offers short-term comfort at the cost of long-term connection. But real healing happens when we stop running. When we sit in the discomfort. When we meet each other with presence instead of performance. You don't need to chase clarity. You just need to stay with it. And if the other person can't meet you there, you can still choose to be the one who does.